So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. You're all very welcome. My name is Jonathan Fowler. I'm the Chief of Communications, Information and Outreach here at UNCTAD. I've met many of you already. To my right, we have our Secretary General, Dr. Mukisa Kitui, and our Deputy Secretary General, Isabelle Durand. Dr. Kitui will be speaking to you to begin with. I'd just like to give you a quick reminder of the rules of the game. As you were aware, registration was open until the 16th of May. We asked everyone who registered to, if they would like to speak, and on which themes they would like to speak. We have a list of 4 speakers already lined up for each of the 4 themes, which are related to the themes that will be coming up next month at the Trade and Development Board. So we'll be calling on those speakers first. As I mentioned, this is meant to be a discussion, so we'll be giving the opportunity to members, representatives of our member states, and as well to UNCTAD staff members to react to what may be said or to give their own comments on the 4 themes. Just a quick reminder on the themes: new ways in which the United Nations could address the crisis of multilateralism and trade, its development machinery, and what would be the contribution of UNCTAD, plugging financial leakages, mobilizing domestic and international resources to deliver these sustainable development goals, building resilience to multiple shocks affecting people and sustainable development, and industrial policies and productive capacity policies for a digital economy. And we've prepared background reports on each of these, and I hope everybody's had a chance to respond. If not, you'll be able to find them online. For those of you who couldn't make it to Geneva to follow the discussions, we're broadcasting the hearing live from our Facebook account. And just as a final procedural matter, as was explained on the hearing webpage, there's unfortunately no translation available for today's hearing, so we'll be asking everyone to please give their comments in English. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Mukisa Kitui.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, Deputy Secretary General, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. May I first, on behalf of UNCTAD, bid you all welcome to this meeting. I am very happy to have you joining us in Geneva, discussing on some of the issues that are key to our sense of issues of the moment, and hopefully making a concrete contribution to the deliberations that are coming up in the TDB this year. I elect not to give a substantive statement about the content of this program because some of the issues of our sense of the issues are covered in documents that have been made available to you, and 2, that will be substantively making our contributions during the TDB. But having said that, I just want to mention a few things that I think are important in kind of characterizing the moment in which we are today. Civil society, much more than the rest of us, are paid of the headwinds that are confronting multilateralism today. We live at a time when we're not just confounded by the declining market value of truth, but also that sentiments that go contra to the spirit that informed Sustainable Development Agenda have not only become mainstream but legitimized, which represents a very, very serious challenge to our ability to mobilize goodwill, to project collective goals and collective steps. Now, embedded in that is a number of things. 1, a declining spirit of international solidarity. That the notion of me against the world narrows the boundaries of moral compass, of social responsibility, and of collective action. And that multilateralism can only succeed if we push back the legitimizing sense of narrow territorial identity as the way. And these are collective challenge to those of us who believe that common challenges require common solutions, that the spirit of multilateralism is not an accident, is a result of centuries of human experience and dedication to finding lasting solutions and finding the limiting threat of shallow nationalism that has, if anything, negated collective interest in the past. We have to find in our discourse, whether on issues of trade, investment, and SDG, or globally in the pursuit of global sustainable models of solutions, a way of resuscitating the optimism that we had about multilateralism, returning the stigma to narrow nationalism as a solution, as a method in dealing with the global challenges. We at this institution are painfully aware that already only briefly out of the basement of the road towards 2030, a lot of ground is being lost in the pursuit of what we thought was a collective dedication. We are seeing a limited resource mobilization for the 3 I's of SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Already globally, a deficit of $2.5 trillion. Africa alone about over $200 billion. There is a trap that we have to be conscious of. While it is important to see and emphasize the importance of private sector to mobilize additional resources, of looking to the domestic constituency for mopping up resources for financing the SDG agenda, it sounds very good. But in very many of the most vulnerable countries, those are statements that excuse our collective responsibility. It is good to mobilize private sector resources. It is good to look at how you can domestically enhance resources. And we have to look at those. And in the course of this week, of the TDB week, we are going to look at how best to address those issues. But at the end of the day, we must not run away from a reality that certain actions are global responsibility. Certain commitments are commitments to developing and particularly most vulnerable countries, and we should not disguise that responsibility by overemphasizing domestic resource mobilization. Related to this is my sense that we have not modeled sufficient mechanisms for growing not only outrage about illicit flows from developing countries, but the science and the practice of how to stem those illicit flows. I remember a few years ago, we published a report about illicit flows from the mining industry in Africa and Latin America. Enterprises that are involved in these exercises were the loudest in trying to question the scientific method with which we had undertaken this exercise. But in the process of trying to say, unless you have pure science, you are peddling bias against mining industry, the main point is lost, that this is a critical area of application. We need to fashion tools acceptable globally, and we need to work together to benchmark what are best practices as a way not only of reining in illicit flows, but also improving the ability of watchdogs like civil society on the abuse of investment possibilities, particularly in vulnerable countries. I think as we go to looking at illicit flows, let's go beyond the outrages of exposed Panama Papers and outrages that we only discovered secondarily because America is trying to rein in those who are evading paying American taxes. And then accidentally in doing that, they happen upon those who are stealing the taxes of even more vulnerable countries. I think we should start systematically building a constituency globally. And this can only be driven by civil society that says resource hemorrhage through mispricing, misinvoicing, and a declaration of the value of what is extracted, and other underhand exercises are a major threat to the utilization of national resources in vulnerable economies at a time when we need much more contribution from domestic resources to reduce the gap in funding SDG agenda. I hope that in your discussions, you help us build the political constituency that says the world cannot afford to already give up on SDG agenda this early in the day. And in doing that, we have to scan the horizon, deal with emerging challenges. We have been raising our voice about the sustainability of growing public and corporate debt in the developing and middle-income countries. And Deborah, I want to express our appreciation for a very competent presentation during our hearing on debt at the General Assembly earlier in the year. But by IMF's own reckoning, of the 69 poorest countries in the world, only 11 are free from a medium-term risk of debt default. If you look at this and the reality of steadily increasing interest rates in the US, you will see the pressures that are building are almost certainly going to lead to significant defaults. And this happens at a time when our best efforts to mobilize international goodwill for a rules-based debt workout mechanism have not found any sufficient traction to be turned into practice. Our principles for responsible borrowing and sovereign borrowing and lending receive lip service, but we are not working through with other players globally in making this the foundation of a viable, dignified resolution to debt stresses that are almost certainly inevitable coming our way. I think it's appropriate that as you embark upon this meeting, some of these things are part of the agenda that color your specific recommendations, which we are very, very keen to listen to you about and to integrate in our own thinking as we go towards the definitive Trade and Development Board meeting coming up. And finally, I just want to mention something that part of the main agenda that we've been having over the past 1 year in improvement of our intergovernmental machinery is finding a way of going beyond talking to each other like to acquire, to the converted, and then going home and waiting for another year to come back and do the same thing. So we are very, very keenly trying to engage New York in a way that decisions, discussions going on in Geneva are lifted as text and be made part of the discourse at the high-level political forum in July. As in this context, that one, we organized the high-level segment of the TDB this year on the 4th of June. Unfortunately, the Deputy Secretary General was also supposed to speak on this occasion, has had to excuse herself because she will be launching the technology bank in Turkey on exactly the same day. But we'll have a window, she will be back here, we'll have a special session with her on the 6th of June. Basically summarizing the sense of the Geneva discourse and in a way, finding a way of building this into resolutions that can fit into New York. Finally, I go back to the first item on this agenda. We at UNCTAD are strongly concerned that the crisis with the WTO, the UN system must find a way of progressing some of the issues that were expected to be progressed through WTO, particularly issues of a development nature. And for us, one of the best examples is disciplining fisheries subsidies. As you may know, SDG 14.6 on the ocean economy anticipated there will be a quick harvest, an early harvest by 2020 of this commitment on disciplining fishery subsidies. The most important work done on this was at UNCTAD 14 in Nairobi, when we mobilized together with UNEP and FAO, 70 countries to pledge their commitment that we work towards a rules-based tightening and hope that at WTO ministers will pass a rule reflecting the spirit of Nairobi. We brought this to Buenos Aires. There was no significant opposition to this, but it was hostage to the other politics of WTO, and nothing was done. It is too risky to leave this to the next WTO ministerial, and there's no guarantee that by that time anything credible can be done out of WTO. So our sense is the UN system must take up responsibility for our UN agenda. And one such suggestion is that we continue deliberations on how to discipline fisheries subsidies and bring these to the member states through the General Assembly or through amendment to the law of the sea as a way of disciplining the fisheries industry consistent with aspirations of Agenda 2030. And these are just some of the thoughts that are going through in our deliberations here. And I just wanted to share with you as I bid you welcome. And I share a last secret that part of my pride in our new Deputy Secretary General is that she's got the DNA of civil society. And the last job that she reluctantly put aside, and I insisted she had to, is to take leave of her responsibility on a civil society organization with a major activity in Central Africa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General, for that introduction. We will now move to the speakers, and I'd like to call upon the first civil society representative, who is Deborah James, Director of International Programs at the Centre for Economic and Policy Research. So if you could speak for approximately 5 minutes, no more. Thank you.
Here. My name is Deborah James, and I'm representing the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And I also coordinate Our World is Not for Sale, which is a global network of CSOs that is committed to a sustainable, socially just, democratic, and accountable multilateral trading system. The turning away of the U.S. from multilateralism is a grave problem for all of us, and we appreciate UNCTAD's concern about the crisis in multilateralism with regards to trade rulemaking. The refusal of the U.S. and now other countries to conclude the development agenda in the WTO leaves in place asymmetrical and anti-development rules that constrain development policy space, including that make it difficult for countries to achieve the SDGs. We appreciate UNCTAD's efforts to emphasize the importance of multilateralism, and we must also emphasize that it depends greatly on the policies of the rules that are governing the multilateral system. We would argue strongly against UNCTAD taking on a consensus-building role on the so-called new issues when the development agenda and special and differential treatment and reforms of agriculture have yet to be concluded. We are gravely concerned about the acceleration against the deformation of the multilateral trading system into an overlapping series of plurilaterals and bilaterals. It is clear that proponents of neoliberal ideology within the WTO are utilizing a plurilateral method of negotiations to gain consensus amongst extremist neoliberal outliers with the intent of imposing their pro-corporate, anti-development worldview on the rest of the world through the WTO at a later date. And we feel that UNCTAD should be raising alarm about this situation. UNCTAD should instead repeatedly highlight the importance of reshaping the current system around the needs of developing countries to operate in a development facilitating multilateral trade system rather than facilitate the introduction of new pro-corporate issues like rules on e-commerce, investment facilitation, and MSMEs. We must also admit we're a little surprised about certain issues that don't seem to be covered in the report. There appears to be no major discussion about the distributional impacts of trade, both between as well as among countries. And today, most of the gains from trade are being captured not only by developed countries, but by developed country investors in developing countries. Obviously, trade cannot be considered as a standalone goal, but it is a means to promote development and an improvement in people's well-being. Trade policies do not obviously exist in a vacuum, but must be considered in the policy environment in which they operate. We in Our World is Not for Sale are also seriously concerned about the issue of differentiation. The U.S. and the European Commission are advocating for differentiation among developing countries. But countries like India and China's population include the largest numbers of poor people in the world. And we would like to see UNCTAD advocate more strongly against the efforts to destroy developing country unity and dishonest efforts to portray some emerging markets as if they were developed countries, which they are not. Particularly, there is a need we see to counter the anti-China attacks occurring in the global trade system. We know that the vast majority of growth and poverty reduction in the last 30 years has actually occurred because of China, either poverty reduction within the country or from countries being able to export to China. But the hostility of developed countries towards China's model is becoming a problem for multilateralism and for poverty reduction. We should be looking at China's model and seeing what can be extracted as a model for other countries, not adopting it wholesale, but looking at what can be extracted, including issues like government regulation of the financial sector, domestic investment in production, control of the central bank, public ownership of production, etc. Even Argentina's rapid growth, until the current government, was not derived from a commodity export boom as is widely believed, but from domestic consumption, as we have demonstrated in research available at CEPR.net. Returning to the trading system and the SDGs, we would like to raise concerns about trade agreements taking away policy space needed for development and achieving the SDGs. In particular, we are outraged that there remains in place a system of rules which allow developed countries to subsidize agriculture, even when this harms the farmers of developing countries, while developing countries are constrained by WTO rules from investing in their own agricultural production, even when it is for domestic consumption. Now, the SDGs clearly call for an increase in investment by developing countries in agriculture, but this is constrained by WTO, and we would urge UNCTAD to contribute to raising the alarm about this situation. Likewise, we agree that it is essential to discipline fisheries subsidies, but we need to preserve development policy space. And we are thus glad that what was on the table at the WTO was actually not concluded at MC11. And we appreciate UNCTAD's role in this regard and encourage it to continue to play this very important role towards a pro-development policy with regards to disciplining harmful fishing subsidies. Finally, we call for, and we believe that there is a need for an independent global competition authority. We believe that this should be advocated for by UNCTAD, and if UNCTAD is not interested in hosting it, we advocate for the revival of UNCTAD's principles on restrictive business practices, which refer to corporate monopoly behavior. And in closing, I would just like to raise concern about the killing of the public symposium. It's unfortunate at this point that we actually have more opportunity to share as civil society our views with and interact with governments during the public forum of the WTO than we do at UNCTAD. And we urge UNCTAD member states to reinstate this dynamic intellectual contribution to the debate by ensuring proper resources for the public symposium in the future. We thank you so much for the ability to contribute to this conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. Before giving Member States and UNCTAD representatives an opportunity to react, I'd like to move to our second speaker, who is Stefano Prato, the Managing Director of the Society for International Development. Stefano.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And when we're looking at the current crisis of multilateralism, of course, there are many concerns that can be raised, but every crisis comes with a number of opportunities. Now, of course, it's a moment globally of significant political regression, so I say that with a little bit of hesitation, knowing that, that it could also come with greater risks. But one should look a little bit at the opportunity that is in there. And the fact that a sort of a WTO-ruled sort of trade regime has in many ways been the main driver of a form of globalization that hasn't been friendly to development for sure. It has been fundamentally predatory in nature, hegemonic, and homogenizing. So the fact that we come at a moment in which comes into some level of crisis, opens opportunities for rethinking, and mostly drops the pretense that WTO could actually meaningfully address the trade and development nexus, which is a little bit what I read in the statement of the Secretary General. The question is how to construct either a new or a new old space in the context of the United Nations that can advance the trade and development agenda, and how to do it, recognizing that that can only come if there are some fundamental rethinking of development strategies. I mean, we've seen this year that the global modest upturn of the global economy have come with an increase in poverty, with an increase in emissions and with an increase in the profile of vulnerabilities. So we live in a situation in which the economy fails us when it's in recession, but equally fails us when it grows again. So it's very clear that we are at a point in which, if we need to advance in the development venture, we need to rethink our development strategies. So 3 critical points in this. First, in terms of the issue of the trade and development conversation, we need to revert the terms of the question. We have been operating over the last decades in a trade and maybe development context, and I think we need to start reversing the equation and discuss development and maybe trade. And in the UNCTAD document for the Trade and Development Board, the development side of the equation is too weak. And certainly not at the level of a very sophisticated and very developmental work that UNCTAD has been doing over the years. It's very clear that the critical issue is to shift, in many developing economies, to shift the center of gravity away from the global into the domestic economy. And that, unfortunately, export-led strategy haven't helped. Have helped a bit, but not substantially. And if the center focus becomes how to rethink local development strategies, really to strengthen the domestic economy, to shift attention, again, in the virtuous relationship within sectors, that's the only way to advance economic diversification. The paper mentions economic diversification, but trade hasn't been friendly to that, has been actually pushing for the opposite, for very strong specialization and very strong delinkage of the primary sector from industrialization challenges. So there is a need, if you want to be serious and not only put out buzzwords, to fundamentally address this question. And in that question, recognize the dynamics that push for rent economies versus wage economies. One fundamental dimension and problem that came with trade is the rendered wage an obstacle to competitiveness. While if we look at them in the context of a growing domestic economy, wages and growing wages are the only fundamental way to grow out of a structural demand gap, which is typical of domestic economies. So I think there's some rethinking in the way in which we look at this. A second key issue is to keep it real. What do I mean about this? When we're looking about the struggling domestic economies, and in particular the struggling transformation that agriculture is going through, the processes that come, the very strong push of dematerialization, digitalization, and financialization, that really create a huge gap between the real economy in which people, their lives, their communities, their rights are located, is increasingly growing. And to some extent, this requires, it may contain some opportunities, but I think in the way in which we see it coming out from UNCTAD, the opportunity side of things needs to be problematized much more. And I'm thinking particularly at the challenges of agroecological transformations in many developing, and not only developing, developed economies as well. And digitalization of seeds, dematerialization of food, financialization of land is not helping this process. It's actually becoming a structural obstacles to this kind of process of virtuous transformations. And that takes me to the third and last issue. So why, if we should be placing greater emphasis in rethinking strategies to grow the domestic economies, where do we locate multilateralism? Because it may sound a paradox, right? If we are going into that direction, why do we need to reassert and reaffirm and strengthen multilateralism? Because the real systemic obstacles to structural transformations in developing countries are not local or not exclusively local, are fundamentally within the current economic, financial, monetary, and trade macro systems. And that's what we need a new multilateralism for. Now, is trade going to be a front runner in that reaffirmation of a multilateralism by choice rather than by default? I don't think so. it's too much a contested area for it to be a front runner. The front runner is going to be tax cooperation and the fight against illicit financial flows. I think that the energy and the conviction that we need an inclusive, UN-centered forum and space to really negotiate and redefine international tax cooperation is mounting. And I think that is fundamentally the path breaker, the game changer of multilateralism. The moment we assert that, this is the moment in which we enter into a new phase. So it's not only important for tax, but it's actually important to create this new age of multilateralism. That is going to come next, or maybe even first, particularly with the urgency of the Caribbeans. So those are my reflections, Secretary General and other colleagues, and I think I'll stop here, because otherwise we kill all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefano. I'd like to give Dr. Kitui an opportunity to react, if you would like to do so immediately.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I was going to go away, but I thought I will have a sampling of the soup and then invite Isabel to go to the main course. Just 2-3 things. First of all, I can understand anxieties about a world that is betraying our collective challenge. But I'm hesitant to place the responsibility for fixing the world at the pedestal of UNCTAD. We're all looking for solutions and we put it at my doorstep. How do I mean this? WTO is an institution with a different mandate from my own. It's a trade liberalization organization. Problems in the sunshine, in the dreams, aspirations that WTO will fix trade as an enabler of development have led a lot of people to lose faith in the role that trade can play. But I'm not going to fix that at the level of WTO. We can express ourselves to some of the concerns at WTO and some of the frustrations about missed opportunities, particularly the virtual absence of serious action on agriculture, which was the key promise for development deliverables under the multilateral trade rule-making system. But having said that, I think as head of UNCTAD, I need to present our sense that features like investment facilitation, like e-commerce, have a different bearing when you're talking about them as pragmatic work of technical support from when you're talking about them as a front of rule-making in the multilateral system. When you are talking about e-commerce at WTO, you are talking about rules-based agreement about how to liberalize e-commerce. We're talking about investment facilitation. You'll be talking about methods of protecting investment through a global rules-based system. For us at UNCTAD, it's different. We've been doing trade facilitation long before before Bali. ASICUDA, our customs management automated system, is one of the most successful examples of trade facilitation in the world. It had nothing to do with the WTO rulemaking. And our development of it did not have any statement about whether countries should negotiate trade facilitation before the Doha round had been completed. I was celebrating the other day in Afghanistan. In 7 years of installing ASICUDA, customs revenues rose from $50 million to $1 billion. To us, that is concrete deliverable, but it totally sidesteps the debate of our new issues being embraced before the agenda of Doha has been realized. I mention that because I think it's very important to differentiate between our work on e-commerce and attempts to introduce e-commerce in the rulemaking at WTO. It's a totally different phenomena, and our work has absolutely nothing to do with whether we are judgmental that it is right or wrong. Similarly, our agenda on investment facilitation is driven by an understanding that liberalizing and reducing the cost of trade without building a capacity for what you put into the marketplace is the road towards one-sided import trade. And that one of the promises of trade as a deliverable on development is to build a capacity to produce something to trade outward. So investment facilitation pari passu with trade facilitation. builds the potential of trade contributing to development. It does not talk to the discussions at WTO whether investment facilitation should be part of the agenda in rulemaking or not. So I think it's very, very important. We have tried to explain to member states in Geneva, and we also explain to civil society that you separate in your minds our work which is ongoing and is not related to the agenda of WTO from the desires, positive or negative, to front-load e-commerce investment facilitation on the menu of rules-making at WTO. On the issues that you raised, I think it's a very interesting debate. It's important and necessary debate that we look at the different drivers. I will not say that a key panacea is taxation. What I would say, tax has something to do with it. Indeed, dealing with the debt has to do something with it. And the hemorrhage of domestic resources is important. But at the end of the day, what kind of balance we find between a developmental state which seizes the moment, creates conditions under which productive capacities build in a sustained way that leads to ever-rising productivity of labor and structural transformation, and what responsibilities lies with the rest of the world to create an enabling environment for these efforts to translate in viable livelihoods. That is the debate that we will encourage at this meeting. So it's useful and helpful to listen to the different suggestions, but I will be hesitant to have a narrow path about what is orthodoxy in an ever complex and uncertain environment. Basically, I just wanted to make my 5 pence worth of suggestion on this and say, I mean, these are nice moments, and I'm hoping that very useful, exciting discussions will come out of this, and important insights will inform what we bring to the TDB and eventually to the high-level political forum in July. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kitui. We'll now give member states an opportunity to react if anybody would like to talk. And I will just hand over the chair very briefly to my colleague Tim Sullivan, who is there.
Are there any member states that would like to respond to anything that's been said so far? Okay, well, then we will continue with the discussion. And I would like to call on Rashid Kaukab, Executive Director, GUTS International. You have the floor.
Thank you. GUTS International is grateful for this opportunity to participate. Distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, Charles Dickens famously wrote after the first industrial revolution, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." One wonders whether that is how the current period would also be described later. We seem to be living in a world of contradictions. On the one hand, the technological advances and innovations, social and environmental changes, and evolution in economic structures and paradigms have thrown up complex challenges and opportunities that can best be faced through international cooperation. And on the other, the multilateralism, particularly related to trade and development, seems to be on the retreat. How to resolve this contradiction, and what role can UNCTAD play based on its mandate and competence? First task in this endeavor must be finding the causes behind the symptoms. There is a growing public discontent, both in developed and developing countries. The populist rhetoric, often based on distorted facts and in pursuit of narrow political interests, is certainly not helping. But taking the podium to preach the benefits of globalization and free trade will not be enough to counter that. public suspicion and even mistrust needs more than lectures. It needs a counter-narrative, a narrative that is truthful, honest, balanced, and convincing. A narrative that admits that trade produces both winners and losers, that technological changes are bringing about both opportunities and marginalization, and that the final outcome is not preordained, but will depend on our policies and actions. The narrative should also include a menu of those policies and actions. This should show, for example, that trade can be poverty sensitive, gender sensitive, labor sensitive, and environmentally sensitive, that it can protect workers as well as consumers. UNCTAD, with its expertise on issues related to trade and development, is well suited to this task. Its research and analysis function should be used to identify the causes, outline possible solutions, and develop a robust and real counter-narrative with policy options. Second task is to have open, frank, and constructive discussions among relevant stakeholders. Exchange of information can dispel misconceptions. Sharing of ideas can lead to the identification of novel solutions, and dialogue and debate can develop common understandings. Governments around the world need to talk among themselves in a setting without pressure and without feeling defensive, and informed by the inputs of other relevant stakeholders, including the civil society. Such exchange, debate, and dialogue can lead to finding the common ground, a consensus on what needs to be done and how that can be done. UNCTAD is well placed to provide such a setting through its consensus-building function. Its deliberations are not geared towards mandatory rulemaking. Its multi-stakeholder approach ensures that a larger group of stakeholders is able to provide inputs, and the outputs of its research and analysis can contribute to the deliberations toward intergovernmental consensus building. Finally, the third task is to build the capacities of developing and least developed countries to better understand and address the challenges, and also to have the capacity for their informed participation in multilateral discussions. The technical assistance mandate of UNCTAD provides an opportunity for that. Let us hope that someone in the future will not write about the current times what Dickens had written about the first industrial revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to call on Sonia Smith, legal advisor with Third World Network.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for making time. I know this is a busy week in Geneva, and so we appreciate you including us as well. Third World Network is a group of organizations that works on development. We have an office here in Geneva, and I'm a legal advisor. So as we heard, this is a key time to be discussing multilateralism. There's many challenges to it, including the possibility that the World Trade Organization's appellate body stops working if the US continues to block new members from being appointed. So to save time, I agree with everything that Deborah James and others have said. And in addition, I was looking at how some of the current and proposed rules at the WTO and in free trade agreements can restrict the ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, there are proposals at the WTO to fix the existing rules, like implementation issues or special and differential treatment, in ways that would help achieve the SDGs, but these are being blocked at the WTO by the developed countries. On the other hand, the proposed new rules at the WTO can make it harder to achieve the SDGs. For example, there are SDGs on affordable access to essential services like energy, internet, education, transport, and these can be jeopardized by the proposed domestic regulations disciplines, which are currently most actively being negotiated in the plurilaterals at the WTO. And I have a paper on this for those who are interested. The environmental sustainable development goals, for example, to reduce pollution, can be harder to achieve, again, if the proposed domestic regulation disciplines are accepted, especially since we know how difficult it is to use the WTO's environment exception. Thirdly, the SDG on diversifying the economy, doing value added, industrializing, and so on. One of the key proven methods to do this is to have export taxes on your raw materials going out the way Indonesia did, but the EU has proposed in the WTO NAMA negotiations to restrict these. Similarly, countries like the US develop their multinational companies through government procurement contracts, but in the name of e-commerce, the EU has proposed total liberalisation of e-commerce for all WTO members, for all goods and services, for all ministries, even the $1 contract. So that method of industrialisation is also proposed to be cut off. We also heard from the Secretary-General about the importance of financing the SDGs, and the SDGs themselves include strengthening domestic resource mobilisation. But again, the proposed new rules at the WTO would reduce government revenue and make it harder to collect taxes, both from the standard proposals in liberalisation of tariffs on imported agricultural products and manufactured products, but also because the proposed domestic regulation disciplines would restrict licensing fees, and the e-commerce proposals would restrict tax revenue in 5 different ways, and we have papers just at the entrance there if you're interested. In addition, the UNCTAD paper prepared for the TDB proposes a number of policies, but these can also be hampered by the proposed trade rules. For example, there's proposals to have technology transfer, which is also an SDG for environmentally sustainable technology. But in the name of e-commerce at the WTO, the US is proposing a total ban on technology transfer requirements for all WTO members, including least developed countries, with no exceptions, not even for the environment. Obviously, this is a TRIMS plus investment issue, not allowed to be negotiated in the Doha round, but it's being slipped in the name of e-commerce. Similarly, learning by doing is recommended by UNCTAD. A common way of doing this is to require joint ventures, but if you made market access commitments in services at the WTO, you can't require joint ventures. On fishing subsidies, yes, it's an SDG, but the SDG includes effective special and differential treatment for developing countries and LDCs, because we know fishing is an important employer, a source of food, exports for many developing countries and LDCs. So while there is an environmental problem of overfishing due to overcapacity, a lot of this is because of the developed countries' fishing subsidies. For example, 13 EU countries provide more subsidies than the total value of their fish landings. And yet developing countries, in many of our countries, fisherfolk are the poorest of the poor and need subsidies to survive. And if the exceptions are only for fisherfolk in small boats in developing countries, or artisanal fisherfolk, or those in the exclusive economic zone, this doesn't address the question of the high seas fishing rights. Because in the high seas, the rules are the countries who have the boats to fish there are allowed to fish. So the EU and Japan can fish in the Indian Ocean, but if Indian fisherfolk have no boats big enough to go to the high seas of the Indian Ocean to catch tuna, India would not be allowed to subsidise them under the proposals. They have to allow EU and Japan to keep taking the tuna out of the Indian Ocean, consuming it and selling it. Second last, on trade facilitation, of course, as the Secretary-General said, trade facilitation per se is different to the rules being proposed in the WTO. And trade facilitation per se, countries can do any time they want, to the extent they want. But the WTO's trade facilitation rules have onerous new requirements, especially for developing countries and LDCs, but it also has agreed transition periods. So developing countries and LDCs should be allowed to fully use those. If they want to do it faster, they always can. And then lastly, we understand that the position of the head of the UNCTAD Trade Division is currently vacant. And as a development-centred organisation, we hope that the head of UNCTAD's Trade Division would be someone who has a long record of expertise in development-centred analysis of trade agreements and what a pro-development trade system looks like, not just how to implement the existing trade rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Okay, so those are the 4 speakers who had already indicated that they wanted to talk on this topic when they registered. So again, I would like to now open the floor for any representatives of member states if they would like to comment on anything that's been said. Would any UNCTAD staff members like to comment on anything that's been said so far? Okay, well then I'm going to now hand over the microphone to our Deputy Secretary General for her to give comments.
Thank you, Tim. So first of all, I present myself to you because we never met. Maybe Deborah I met in Buenos Aires, but for the main representative of civil society here, I don't know you, so it's the first time that we meet. I'm very happy to start this dialogue, because I think that, so explained a little bit shortly, the Secretary General, I think that the link and the relationship with the civil society is really one key question regarding all what we can do in the future, even if sometimes we disagree, but the important thing is, of course, to dialogue and try to look how we could nourish the strategy of UNCTAD in the next period. So that's for the introduction. What about, I heard from Cuts and from TWN, I think that, of course, you explained you remind the different tools of the different pillars of UNCTAD. Analysis tools, what was said in your two first speeches, what about how could we help the countries with good analysis tools in order to transform the economy, to fight against illicit financial flows, etc., and giving them the enough equipment in order to work on that, because of course that's obvious, but we are not a government, so we are only there in order to try to equip, to influence, to help, to support, to assist on base of the needs of the countries. And sometimes the needs of the countries are not exactly the same as the needs that you highlight here. Of course, the diversity of the government for the different countries are a reality that we have to work on and we work with, even if, of course, we are there in order to provide for especially for the developing countries, the tools in order to negotiate properly, to help in some steps in the WTO, to help. For example, I was 2 days ago, in a conference organized by the Francophonia on the medicine in developing countries, and especially the very low level of quality of medicine. It's not only that, it's sometimes really a problem with the faux médicaments, fair,
counterfeit.
Yeah, so it's why contrafection of the medicine is very dangerous for health of people. That's traffic. That's really an enormous market. And sometimes regarding what you said about illicit financial flows, this sector is huge. And I discovered the size of this problem. We discuss on that, and why I speak on that, because I think that what we discuss at the end is how could we work for a local production of medicine in the countries. That is related to what you explained about the necessity to relocalize the economy or to work on local or regional level in order to keep better control in the hand of the countries for the benefit of the production and the benefit of the trade. So on that, I think that it's a plan between different organizations in order to try to help for the local production of medicine in some developing countries. It's a way to work on the diversification. It's a way to work on, of course, on health. It's a way to work also on the production from medicine, oriented to the needs of the country and not to the needs of the big companies regarding only production. And I discover, I don't know if you knew that, but there are sometimes in some countries, production of medicine for the developed countries and production on low level medicine for the developing countries or the poor countries. That's really, it was a surprise for me until there. So of course, we knew a lot of things. So I use this example because I think that providing to the countries the tools and the capacity to negotiate with those firms, to avoiding that they could, in some very difficult negotiation, that they are completely abused in a negotiation regarding the results on the ground. And, for example, when you speak about local production of medicine, it could not be only a firm coming in the country and repeating the same, and probably with a low level of salary, with a low level of social protection for the workers. No, the problem is how could you encourage and support local producers with their own capacity and control on the production and the selling of the medicines. That's very different. And to do that, we need to equip the countries to negotiate that, to negotiate the transfer of savoir-faire, but also to negotiate the capacity with the license and the patterns. That's very, very specific. And I think that's one of the tasks of UNCTAD is to do that pragmatically, giving the tools to negotiate, so the analysis tool. The second pillar that you remember, it's the consensus building. Of course, consensus building, well, I come from the European Parliament, so I know that, of course, the consensus building, it's, well, nice, but it's a difficult task. It means that you have to find the way and the item where precisely you can find a consensus between people, or people, I mean not people, but countries or representative of the countries, who disagreed on some things, and disagreed ideologically sometimes, disagreed for some different reasons. That's life, that's all life. So consensus building is a huge task, but I think that it's important to start or to try to develop some agreement on some concrete things, some steps. Probably not all what you ask and what you hope and what I hope. What about taxation? What about all those things? But step by step, trying to build some consensus and using those consensus on the appropriate place. And it's why, for example, the illicit financial flows, what UNCTAD did in the FFD forum in New York, I think that it was really useful. It's difficult because it's one part of the FFD process. Illicit flows is one part of the discussion, but it's an issue where we are really able to provide not only analysis but tracks for change the things. And I think that in this forum, UNCTAD was heard and perceived as a legitimate and really credible interlocutor, speaker. Well, it don't mean that the solution that we proposed, that we negotiate here in Geneva, will be adopted tomorrow. But I think that it's important not only to have a consensus between us in Geneva, but to do something with this consensus outside of Geneva, and especially in the place where decision could be taken in the future. So that's what the SG spoke about, Geneva-New York relationship, and it's very important to keep in mind that it's good to have a good discussion here, or to equip the country. It's also important to have an agreement useful in a specific place, and especially for this case in the FFD process. And what about the technical assistance that the CUTS representative remind? I think that also this technical assistance try to use first of all the development goals, not only the SDG as such, but the development goals, which are the priorities in the countries, because it depends from one country to another, and to develop on this SDG really a strategy. And even if we are speaking about e-readiness assessment for the e-trade, etc., it's not e-trade for e-trade as such. It's really e-trade in order to develop new activities for young people, for women, in the hand of the people, avoiding that the big giant could only absorb all the e-trade aspects, but to develop the capacity for new people to create some activities through e-trade. It's not e-trade for the beauty of e-trade or for the beauty of technology, even if we know that technology is there and that the countries, of course, could not stay beyond all this evolution. What about the relationship with WTO? I will confirm completely what explained the SG. We are not WTO. Of course, we are working with, where we try to understand all the process in the WTO. But we are sometimes a more safe place, I mean safe, without threat regarding rules, etc. And some issues could be, or I hope, and it's the case step by step, could be discussed freely here between people with different point of view on those issues. But I think that the place that UNCTAD could offer in this very special moment, so you explained that it's really a special moment with many, many threats and danger, also maybe and courteously opportunities, and I agree that it's courteously, but well, if we are not ready to jump, not on a blind way, but really lucidly on these opportunities, I think that you will lose on all the steps. So that's my remarks globally to what you propose. What about the DITC position for the director of the division? You have to know that now it's in the hand of the process. So the shortlist was sent to New York. We are waiting for a decision as soon as possible. So I hope, as you, that it would be a good candidate. Maybe I can try to say that I would like that it could be a woman. But I will not interfere in the process. And of course, not only with a high level of skills and capacity to help this division to provide. They are doing a lot. Huh? Don't think that without a director they were completely lost in translation. Absolutely not. And I think that the capacity for the division to manage the opportunities and the service to the countries, it was really down. But of course, with the director, it's better. So I hope that it will be the case at least in September, maybe just before the summer. But that's my remarks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary General. Before we move to the second theme, I would like to ask if there's any representatives of civil society organizations that would like to give any remarks or comments on this theme that didn't say they wanted to when they registered, but maybe would like to now. Okay. Yes, I see send.
Thanks for giving us the floor. And I'm aware of time. I'd like to just come to one particular topic, and that is Tier 3 of SDG 17. This means public-private partnerships. Now, when it comes to PPPs, I've done presentations for the UN last year in the Caribbean, where a lot of countries are in financial difficulties, and they expect PPPs not necessarily to be the magic bullet, but they expect a lot of help coming from PPPs. I also became aware that most of the ministers present did not know the technicalities and the legal implications of PPPs. Now, I looked it up when it comes to the indicators. 17.171, there's only one indicator. And it just says to measure the amount of US dollars spent per year on PPPs. That's why it's so insignificant and so vague. That's why it's called a Tier 3 indicator. Then I got even further upset when I realized the custodian for 1717 is the World Bank. The World Bank should know much better that when we look at PPPs, there's much more to it, particularly when it comes to SDGs. What is the impact of public-private partnerships? And there's no other partner organization listed, which to my assessment of the situation, it should be at least UNCTAD, who is partnering up or could partner up with the World Bank to bring some sense to this indicator mess, which is insignificant. And since financing is crucial for the SDGs, but it's crucial for the survival of many of especially LDCs, I would hope that with all the knowledge within the House in terms of investment, that UNCTAD could, in that sense, take a step to request to be partner with the World Bank to make better use of the opportunities, which is to define S17.171 in a sensible and also sustainable manner. Thank you.
Okay, since I don't see any other...
I would answer. I take note of your proposal. I think that when I listen to you, it could be very useful to balance the team in charge of this, the custodian in charge of this indicator that's so important. I don't know, frankly, and I speak under the control of some staffs in the rooms, I don't know if we can change the architecture of this SDG strategy indicator, etc. Formally, that's one thing. Maybe yes, maybe not. I have to check that. But in any case, even if it's not formally possible, of course, we can try to advocate this question of balance and risks and equipment of the countries regarding the possibilities, the opportunities, but also the risks of the PPP strategy, especially in energy, water, sanitation, and all those public goods strategy where, of course, it's very expensive to provide the services, and sometimes, but often, the private money and the private support is useful, but it comes back to the regulation and the negotiation of the regulation regarding the capacity for the country to keep ownership, to keep control, and to keep the capacity to be in the control of the situation and not giving the keys to all the different. It's a partnership. It's not normally. Well, maybe.
May I just clarify what you just said? Next year is an opportunity the Statistical Commission meets. It is an opportunity now towards the HLPF and towards next year's meeting of the Statistical Commission to improve on Tier 3 indicators and to add indicators. Targets can no longer be added, which is understandable. But there is an opportunity, so I hope that UNCTAD can take that opportunity and contribute to an improvement of 1717.
Thank you for this technical explanation. I take note of that and I will look at that. You have to know that what about statistics and SDG, we started 1 month ago with a task force in this organization with the people of the different division in order to increase not only the quality but also the priorities in our way to work on statistics and data. We have some mission regarding the UN system, but we have also the capacity to work and to cross and to the quality of the collection of the data, the quality and the integrity of this indicator. So I take note of this possibility and I will look at that.
Okay, since I don't see any flags up, we're going to move to the second theme, since we're also a bit behind on time. And so I would like to call first, this is the theme that's looking at plugging financial leakages. And I'll call first on Daniel Bertosa, who's representing Public Services International, sorry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to take the floor. Public Services International is a global trade union federation that represents trade unions in the public sector in 160 countries who represent approximately 20 million workers. We welcome the background paper and we feel that it's a good summary of the issues, and as Stefano has said, we too feel that this could be an area where some orthodox thinking is shaken up and provides some opportunities. Before I delve into some of those specifics, I'd like to make a couple of broad points that frame this discussion. And the first is that too often we see this debate framed around the idea that public expenditure is a burden to be tolerated, that somehow taxation is a drag on the economy and it's to be minimised. We know over a long period of time, and the evidence shows, that public spending tends, particularly if it's done well, to assist development. We know that most of the wealthy countries who have industrialised had very high expenditure in the public sector and high public sector involvement in the industry and their industrialisation historically, and that when you track the correlation between development and public spending, there's a very strong correlation over time and over the course of development. Not long ago, the UN Commission on Health, Employment and Economic Growth, supported by the OECD and the ILO, produced a very important paper that showed that a dollar spent on health, as an example, has an economic multiplier of between 3 and 4. This means if you tax a dollar and spend it, you create more economic growth than you absorb through the taxation of that dollar. Infrastructure, roads, ports, education, communications, these are all goods that tend to have high public externalities, contribute to economic development, and when countries are industrialising, tend to be provided by public expenditure, and where they're most effective, tend to be provided by the public sector. And finally, stability, which is a very, very important precursor to economic growth, relies heavily on a state that is functional and well supported. Courts, police, and just the democratic institutions are all important preconditions for economic growth. And in fact, we've seen a revision of the view of public expenditure over the previous years. Perhaps the most interesting was the IMF, who in a staff paper issued a culpa mea, which acknowledged somewhat belatedly but very honestly that their public sector multiplier was underestimated. For those who are not econometricians in the room, what that actually means is they said that if you have an economic crisis and you spend on the public sector, actually it creates more stimulus than they previously acknowledged. And I think that's a very important technical contribution to the debate that's being missed. This is all very important because we live in a world, and somebody mentioned this, where we do have sufficient wealth to fund these things. The problem is largely not a technical question, it's a question of political will. And the paper outlines the amount of wealth that is available should we choose to raise it. And this is important because it leads to, if this is not acknowledged, if there's not a fundamental acknowledgement that there is sufficient wealth to invest in these things, and the investing in these things is good for the economy as well as for social outcomes, then it leads to the promotion of second-best alternatives, and it also leads to the promotion of harmful alternatives. And I'm glad that our friend raised the issue of public-private partnerships, because this is a very, very important example where the belief that there is insufficient resources to provide public investment leads to shortcuts that can be harmful. There is no body of evidence that suggests that public-private partnerships are effective. There is much evidence that they result in lower quality services and higher costs. In particular, that they're expensive and poor quality. The IMF, interestingly again, makes it very clear that public-private partnerships should not be used to remove debt from government books. Yet this is the primary reason why public-private partnerships are used, because there's this perception there's not enough resources available, and that somehow you can magic up the resources through the creation of a public-private partnership that completely ignores that while the debt isn't taken on as a debt per se, it is taken on as a guaranteed revenue flow to a private sector provider in the out years. It has exactly the same effect as a debt, with one or two exceptions, and they all make the liability more onerous. The need to pay profits in the form usually of dividends, the need to pay interest because the private sector borrows at higher rates, and what is the irony there, of course, is that we now know that many of these private corporations who provide or who win these concessions make their profits and then shift those profits to tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions and don't even contribute back to the domestic resources of the country in which they're extracting these profits. I will speak on the issue of crises, but it is important to note that debt instruments at the very least are on the public books, and investors know where the debt of the government lies. These concessions are often not on the public books. They're often regarded as commercial in confidence, and we find out only when there is a debt crisis exactly where these instruments lie and the extent to which these liabilities exist. This creates a degree of uncertainty that exacerbates crises, not makes them easier. The evidence, if we need it, is to be found in the widespread remunicipalisation that we see all over the world. I mean, the United Kingdom, which was the inventor of the public-private partnerships, seems to have a scandal every month around the failure of private privatisation. The carry-on scandal. Recently, they have train problems with their privatisation of trains. Prior to that, they had school problems. In Germany, there are a large number, and I'll touch with them on the crisis. But in France, which is an exporter of water services, they've recently remunicipalised Eau de Paris, and in fact the experience there is that the quality goes up and the investment goes up after the remunicipalisation. Moving on. At the heart of this problem, and it's outlined in the paper, is that the rules around international taxation are outdated. They were made in the 20s and the 30s when we didn't have the same transport infrastructure, we didn't have the same communications, and global value chains were very different. The reality is, and the paper outlines it, that the largest category of illicit financial flows is profit shifting from transfer pricing abuse, almost entirely because of the fiction of the arm's length principle. The OECD, who seem to be champions of innovation and modernisation, seem to be willfully blind to modernising and championing innovation around the fundamental principles of corporate taxation, and seem to be stuck on a set of rules that were created almost 100 years ago. Rules that privilege foreign investors and privilege foreign taxpayers, and as a consequence inhibit the growth of small and medium enterprises, the actual driver of economic growth and the backbone of a wage economy as opposed to a rent economy. The Independent Commission on the Reform of International Corporate Taxation makes this clear, and we welcome in the paper that's been provided further discussion around unitary taxation. We believe that's very important. I'll touch quickly on the ideological myth of tax competition. It's an outrageous appropriation of market rhetoric. There is no market for tax. I mean, it's extraordinary appropriation of language, and so therefore there can be no benefit from this so-called competition. It's a rhetoric designed to frame debates around the lowering of tax, as if somehow the lowering of tax is the equivalent of lowering the price on some generic commodity. The reality is that tax policy requires cooperation, and in particular between jurisdictions. And the IMF, again, interestingly, has done very interesting work on spillover effects, and we welcome this acknowledgement, and we welcome in the background paper the discussion of the possibility of a tax treaty, and also the discussion of some form of global coordination through a tax body. Enforcement is a big priority for us. It's not mentioned in the background paper. I think it possibly could be. We do need well-resourced national tax bodies and a whistleblower convention, which we are promoting in the International Labour Organisation to protect those public sector workers and private sector workers who are acknowledged in the literature as being the most likely to come across illicit financial flows and be able to blow the whistle and do something about them. If you do not protect those workers, then the chances of remedying these issues is dramatically decreased. We welcome the focus on transparency. Whether it's avoidance or evasion, without transparency, or those who oppose transparency can be put into two categories. Those who are engaged in illegal activity, and I think there's a fair degree of unanimity around the remedies required there. But perhaps more worryingly is those who are involved in legal or borderline legal activity who benefit from a lack of transparency and the secrecy, not because they're concerned about the legal consequences, but because the practices they engage in are just not justifiable. If they were brought into the public eye, then there would be calls for changes to the regimes. And we think that is where the game changer is, having a better discussion around the rules, and that absolutely requires more transparency, and therefore the focus in this paper on that is welcome. Public country-by-country reporting, the publishing of tax holidays in national parliaments is essential, and also has a very interesting positive effect on the ability to clamp down on corruption. The whistleblowing convention I mentioned, the automatic exchange of information and public beneficial ownership registry are all mentioned in the paper, and we support them wholeheartedly. We think UNCTAD has a very important role to play here, technically, but also not just providing technical assistance to countries, although that is important, but providing a public good and a public service to the international community, because the debate for too long has been captured by certain interests, and the ability to identify the problems and explore alternatives is a service to the international community, and it's a service that UNCTAD is well positioned to play. And if this paper is anything to go by, then we think that contribution will be fulfilled in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To move things along, I'll go ahead and call on the next speaker who had asked to be able to take the floor on this theme, and that is Gijs Verbrak. I hope that I've pronounced that correctly.
Gijs Verbrak.
Yeah. I did my best. Who is Senior Policy Officer with ActionAid International.
Thank you. So indeed, I represent ActionAid, and for those not familiar with ActionAid, it's an international non-governmental organization focused on development cooperation and active in more than 45 countries and focused on tax justice as well. ActionAid shares the position that domestic resource mobilization is of key importance to allow developing nations to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So we were thankful that it was in the paper, and it's also acknowledged by the Agenda 2013 of the UN Financing for Development process. There's a dire need for developing countries to find more funding for gender-responsive public services, and tax revenue is the most sustainable, reliable, and democratic way to do that. However, as ActionAid, we are fully aware of the difficulties developing countries face in trying to raise more tax revenues. It's not only linked to capacity of a certain country to raise more tax revenues, but it's also linked to the willingness of other countries, mainly wealthier countries, to allow developing countries to do so. And it's not only the challenge to raise more revenues, but it's also about how you raise the revenues. For example, you could raise more revenues but undermining simultaneously the goals you're trying to realize with the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to reiterate the reasons or the functions of tax, and that's 4 R's. That's revenue, so the generation of income, redistribution, which can help address economic inequality, so also really linked to the SDGs, SDG 10. Representation, the fostering of democracy and accountability, and the repricing, the promotion of, for example, health and environmental services. But when we look at the tax systems many developing countries have currently, we see huge modes of regressive taxes in there. So taxes that put a tremendous burden on people who cannot afford it or can barely afford to pay tax, while the wealthy walk away almost free. Therefore, we urge the UNCTAD in their agenda to focus also on more progressive taxation, and also developing countries to move to more progressive tax systems. So to shift away from indirect taxes, which have a tremendous burden on poor people, towards more direct taxation of, for example, income and wealth. Those types of taxation are currently highly underutilized. And also, of course, compliance is still an issue in many countries, so more attention should be focused on that. One example of a regressive tax is, for example, VAT, which tends to harm people living in poverty much more than people who can afford to pay tax. When looking at the SDGs with the tax lens, people tend to think there's a connection to be made with SDG 10, so the reduction of inequality within and among countries and between countries, as well as SDG 17, the strengthening of the means of implementation and the revitalized of global partnership for sustainable development. There it has more of a financing role, so a bit the topic we're discussing today. However, tax is also linked to SDG 5, since tax often have a very tremendous burden for women's rights. Often women in developing countries are hit hard by tax, and especially women living in poverty. So there's a need to change that as well, and not only change the regressive taxation that hit women hard, but also to move towards a system in which there's gender responsive public services. So the provision of services that benefit women and will help gender inequality and will help to fulfill the women's rights. But it's not only about looking at how you tax your citizens, but it's also about how you move towards more progressive corporate taxation systems. For example, many developing countries try to attract foreign direct investments, and in doing so they sign away huge numbers, millions of dollars to in tax incentives to multinational corporations, often without a strategy underlying that, and therefore there must be more attention on ensuring that no revenue is foregone by a country without a strong cost-benefit analysis. Tax treaties also play a tremendous role in the facilitation of tax avoidance, and therefore developing countries can have a great benefit of reviewing existing treaties and also come up with a strategy on how to negotiate new treaties, so to ensure that they do not provide opportunities for tax avoidance or to ensure that they do not limit their taxation rights. As mentioned, the ability of developing nations to stop international tax avoidance is highly dependent on the awareness as well as the willingness of developed nations to change their policies and to stop the race to the bottom. Therefore, we urge all countries to review and amend their national tax rules and eliminate harmful tax measures that might have negative spillover effects on revenue collection in other countries, and specifically developing countries, of course. ActionAid launched an updated report of the Stemming the Spills report that provides guidance for nations to engage in a spillover analysis. The OECD process, the base erosion profit shifting process, which was set in motion and which pretended to be the answer to tax avoidance worldwide, can only be regarded as a first start, especially from the perspective of developing countries, since they are left out in many of the measures and we're not sitting as equals around the table. Therefore, we would underline the need for a more democratic forum, and what better place to advocate for a UN global tax body than at the UN itself.
Okay, so before allowing Deputy Secretary General to comment on what's been said, I'll go ahead and move along the list of speakers to try to catch up a little bit. So next in line, we have Athena Peralta, who is a Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice with the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs.
Thank you, first of all, to UNCTAD for this space. The Commission of Churches on International Affairs is a body of the World Council of Churches. The WCC is a fellowship of 348 Christian churches located in 110 countries with a constituency of around 500 million Christians. I will try not to repeat most of what my colleagues have already said. I think coming from a Christian perspective that emphasizes care for the least among us and for the gift of creation, we as churches are deeply concerned about the twin phenomena of widening socioeconomic inequalities and climate change. Since the 2008 financial crisis, asymmetries in income, in wealth, in access, in decision-making power have expanded significantly between rich and poor, capital and labor, developed and developing countries. The concentration of wealth today is at its highest level since the 19th century, and combined with the prevailing environment of austerity, this is creating the conditions for rising extremism, protectionism, racism, and xenophobia that we see today. This feeds into economic destabilization, which in turn feeds conflicts and inflates military budgets, which again then leads to further cutbacks in government budgets for public health, education, and social care. Moreover, these asymmetries are interacting with the impact of climate change. We know that at current trajectories, it is likely that our planet will warm by around 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, and this will definitely bring more frequent and more intense storms and droughts. This will endanger water and food security, especially for the poorest. Our churches in Grenada, in Puerto Rico, in other parts of the Caribbean and the Pacific are already bemoaning and suffering the terrible human and social and ecological costs of recurrent powerful hurricanes. I'm from the Philippines, and year after year we are battered by strong typhoons, and year after year, and even sometimes month after month, we have to rebuild with ever-dwindling resources. Our governments have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 in response to these interlinked crises. However, and we all know that the capacity of our governments, especially developing country governments, to mobilize the resources that are needed to meet the SDGs and to build resilience to climate change has been undermined by systemic tax evasion and avoidance, especially by multinational corporations. The background document estimates that governments are losing around 200 billion annually in tax evasion, in profit shifting, and this is obviously a sum that would be enough to cover the annual costs of meeting a range of SDGs related to health, water, and nutrition. On top of this, and this has already been mentioned, we have neoliberal policies aimed at attracting foreign investments by proffering tax incentives, which are provoking a race to the bottom that is further eating into national tax bases. Again, our churches in Zambia, Tanzania, and other parts of Africa have lamented the fact that large portions of their populations are mired in poverty, confronted by the lack of clean drinking water, by the lack of public hospitals and schools, even as multinational mining corporations extract and ship out tons of precious metals and minerals from their resource-rich lands, with scarcely any benefits accruing to local communities. More and more, market-based instruments, private finance, public-private partnerships are being called to fill in the so-called finance gap. And I say so-called finance gap because, as we all know, we live in an era of unprecedented wealth, and there are sufficient funds to meet the SDGs if we have the political will to pursue them, as my other colleagues have mentioned. At the recently concluded third UN Forum on Financing for Development, as well as in other fora, churches have called for significant investments in what we call public goods, such as in agroecology, in climate-ready infrastructure that creates decent employment, in the social protection of vulnerable sectors in our societies, obviously in health, education, in renewable energies, and in the renewal of our ecosystems. Moreover, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, churches have demanded and continue to demand for the transfer of resources and technology from rich industrialized countries to poor and climate-exposed countries, so that the latter countries can build resilience and forge alternative development paths, but also as reparations for the irreversible loss and damage arising from climate change. Our churches in the Caribbean, in the particular, have strongly pleaded for the cancellation of external debts to free up domestic resources for emergency assistance, rehabilitation, and resilience building in their hurricane-devastated countries. As churches, we recognize that public finance raised through taxation continues to be the most sustainable way of financing long-term development investment projects. And therefore, we have called and continue to call for national and international systems of taxation that reward work, that enable the redistribution of wealth, that guarantee social and economic rights, that promote gender justice, and that penalize public bads such as speculative activities, such as polluting and resource depleting activities. These could include a range of tax instruments, such as, of course, progressive taxation, tax relief for the poor, tax relief for ecologically nurturing activities, capital gains taxes, minimum corporate taxes, financial transaction taxes, carbon and other pollution taxes. And of course, a lot of research has already been gone into these various tax instruments. Churches have likewise called and continue to reiterate calls for the elimination of tax havens, for multinational corporations to report sales, profits, and taxes paid on a country-by-country basis, and also for new approaches to tackle tax competition and to effectively tax multinational corporations. Many of these proposals are already contained in studies conducted, for instance, by the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. And many of these are also already mentioned in the policy note made by UNCTAD. However, we would like to strengthen in particular the call for the creation of a global tax body under the aegis of the United Nations. This is mentioned in the policy note, but needs to be strengthened even more, especially in light of the remarks of the Secretary General this morning, calling for common solutions to common problems. And this can only be done in a space, an international space where we can coordinate global tax regimes and rationalize tax administrations. And we need, obviously, a democratic space to oversee urgently needed transformations in global tax rules. So in summary, it is critical to develop an international institutional framework for fairer tax rules that serve the people and the planet, and we hope that this is something that UNCTAD can strongly push for.
Thank you. And so I'll call on the fourth speaker who already indicated they'd like to talk on this topic, and that is Mr. Mark Hall, who will be representing Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Switzerland.
Thank you. I see you struggling, Tim, with the slipping schedule, so I'll try and help you by being fairly telegraphic, and that is made easier by the fact that many of the essential points were covered by those who spoke before me on this topic, and I agree with much of what's been said there. So I think some very good guidance has been given on what's an incredibly important topic and one that's emerging as really fundamental to meeting the SDG challenges. I'm glad to see that we are, and UNCTAD is, moving beyond the fairly traditional mindset when it comes to funding priorities in developing countries, and is beginning to move beyond sort of domestic resource mobilization and fulfilling many promises made on development assistance and development financing. In fact, the first sentence of the executive summary of UNCTAD's paper says that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals faces a financing gap of trillions of dollars. It's perfectly obvious to anybody who does the math that that will not come from development aid, it won't come from development financing, even concessional financing, and it won't come from domestic resource mobilization, even if it's extraordinarily effective. So we are facing a challenge of a different order, and I'm glad to see that this is your opening sentence because it sets the context for what you're proposing to do. So the estimates that I have seen in a variety of papers and sometimes also at the domestic level suggest that it is not realistic to think of public funding covering more than about 15% of what is required to implement the SDGs. And that the rest, therefore, has to come from financial and capital markets. And as we know, the financial and capital markets are not particularly driven by policy goals like the SDGs. And so we are dealing with a challenge that throws up a number of requirements. The first is that in respect of of private capital, we need to the extent possible to align the behavior that rewards investors with the behavior that advances the Sustainable Development Agenda. And for that, we need reform of many of the rules that govern financial and capital markets such that they are not rewarding anti-SDG behavior, but rather giving incentives to the sorts of action that leads to SDG implementation. What we need on the public side is that 15%, pick a figure out of the air, it doesn't matter whether it's 18 or 14 or 20, that we make extremely good use of that public money, essentially to leverage the money that is needed from the private sector. So we need a rethinking of the role of public money in respect of SDG implementation to ensure that we're using it as a means of multiplying the available funding. And that can be through, first loss provisions, it could be through risk reduction mechanisms, it can be through the kind of public policy, public-private partnerships that Raymond called for earlier. We also need to deal with those aspects of international policy that are currently tripping up that goal, the ability of mobilizing private capital for international public purposes. And both Deborah and Sanya mentioned some of the obstacles that we are struggling with in the international trade regime. And Danielle mentioned some of those that we're struggling with in investment policy frameworks and investment agreements. We need to ensure at least that these are not unfriendly to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that it's important that we focus, that we understand the import or the implications of SDG 17, and not simply when it comes to instructions given to developing countries. For me, the most important part of it comes under the provisions on systemic issues and policy and institutional coherence, where we are asked to enhance global macroeconomic stability, including through policy coordination and policy coherence. And what we have now are policy incoherences that are in fact, a major obstacle to advancing to SDG implementation at the pace and at the scale that we would like. There are also, and we are loath to admit this, internal contradictions within the SDGs that throw up new obstacles and that produce unintended consequences. And I'll just give one example of this that comes from the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosure, in which essentially they are making high financial ratings contingent on a series of measures that advance climate change. Now, they're doing that, I'm sure, with the best of intentions, but they're doing that without actually thinking through the consequences on some of the developing countries and their access to finance. It will affect carbon-dependent countries very significantly, but more generally, the raising of sort of sustainability conditionality represents, in the end, an increase in the cost of capital to developing countries. So their ability to borrow on these markets is made worse. I strongly salute the focus of the paper on what we call the dark side of finance, the illegal, illicit flows, the flows that result from corruption and all the rest. I think the paper focuses, and I understand why it does, rather too much on south-north flows illegal flows or illicit flows, without looking at the broader picture of how those illegal situations come about. And I think that it, in a sense, lets the developed world off the hook to a far greater extent than it should. In that respect, I understand the critical comments made by some of the speakers here on OECD's work on base erosion and profit shifting. But I think there's probably scope for far better cooperation, far closer cooperation between UNCTAD with its focus on defending the interests of developing countries and the work that OECD is trying to do to bring about some minimal disciplines on illegal and illicit financing. And so the final point I would like to make is that there is still relatively little work being done on the impact of illegal and illicit finance on development in developing countries. And I think it's important as a sort of foundation for acting on this incredibly important topic that we understand what actually is the impact of this on development prospects, not simply the kind of figures that you have in the paper that show that this represents X proportion of the X percentage of the GDP, but really to try and understand how much of a factor this is in seeking to implement the SDGs and reach the goals that we've set for ourselves by 2030. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll let our Deputy Secretary General, Madam Jones, give her comments.
Well, small comments, because your speech and your statement are really fruitful regarding you analyze and the tracks that you would like to reinforce in the UNCTAD strategy. First of all, about all the question of public services and all the problem of public investment. And it's true that it's not only a question for developing countries, it's also a question for developed countries. And we know that on developed countries, the problem of lack of public investment in all the different public goods is really an enormous problem, even if, of course, it's less. The consequences are different in the developed countries. So it's really a little bit the mood that we have to change. You explained very well the shift and the necessity to go to public investment in different sectors that you mentioned. So I agree on the idea that we have tried to shift the system. That's, of course, not really easy. And if I agree with the goal, the steps that we have to deliver, it's, of course, analyze, it's, of course, influence, it's advocacy and all those things and steps that we can try to fulfill. It's the same for tax justice. It's true that you remind a little bit the different goals of the taxation, and I agree with the distribution and all those things, etc. But at the end, the problem, especially for the direct taxation in developing countries, it's really that a part of the activity, and especially women. It's an informal sector. How do you tax an informal sector? And all those problematics regarding the direct income on the revenue, and of course the taxation of corporation or tax incentives, changing a little bit tax incentives for corporation is probably a way more useful when you don't have enough capacity to have a formal activity, and that's a big challenge, the formalization of the informal sector, the SMEs, etc. I cannot avoid to speak about the corruption, because in many, many countries, of course, there are a lot of corruption because of the lack of control, the lack of justice, impunity, etc. So how could it be different when the system or the legal system is not so clear and not so efficient regarding the rules and the respect of the rules for everybody? So, and with a lack of services, well, that's a fact, but it's of course a fact that it's a big problem regarding the organization of a taxation system on national level. But I agree that we have to change also all the global taxation system that's more broader than the small countries with more problems. Well, to do that, that's a big also it's a big challenge that we have to try to do, try to develop alliance to do that, and trying to continue. That's the last report, the last TDR, Trade and Development Report, was based on austerity, all the consequences, what about inequalities, etc. So what do we do with this Trade and Development Report? It's a very interesting report. How could we disseminate and try to not only to write it in a nice report, but, well, to change a little bit the thing. So we try to do it in the different places, FFD Forum, HLPF, all the places where we can speak, when we can deliver, when we can act, when we can equip or advise the countries. Of course, we use some element of this report, but that's the limit of an organization as UNCTAD, which is, of course, not a rule organization. What about the things that we contribute to do? You know that there is three important debates. A debate on a tax treaty that you call. So we contribute to all the debate on this issue, delivering or bringing figures, analysis, etc. That's a way. Another way is the contribution, the collaboration of UNCTAD or some people from UNCTAD in the discussion about a binding treaty on human rights for the companies. Well, that's the beginning of the process, but, well, I think that we have to continue to support and to follow that in order to go a little bit further as today. And you know also that there was a debate in the Council of Human Rights about right to development and the link between human rights and rights to development. Well, and in this council, they are also working or try to work on the economic side of the things. It's not only a question of torture or I don't know, freedom of speech, etc. It's also the economic rights and the capacity and the social rights. So I think that these three debates in different places as UNCTAD, as important to follow, to nourish, also for you, because I think it's another way to continue with the same goals. What about the SDG implementation in the timeline? I'm not sure, but, well, we have to provide and to work on that. I would highlight the fact that the public procurement, what you explained about the public services, and it's also a thing that we have to look at, because public procurement is also a tool regarding the capacity for public investment, and associate SMEs and rules in the public procurement could help to develop some local investment as only the opening of all the public procurement to all the companies. About the question of climate change that was highlighted, of course, that's an enormous challenge. That's also an enormous cost regarding the mitigation and adaptation, etc. That's all the question of the Paris Agreement and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And we know that, to explain hurricanes or something like that, that's the issue of the next discussion about resilience after this catastrophic destroying of all the economic efforts could be destroyed in one day through a hurricane or through all those problems. So it's really something that probably UNCTAD have to work more. How could we help or to support through economic or social support or tools, helping to build more stable development regarding against climate change, against all the effects of climate change, which are ongoing. It's not to stop from one day to another, but to change that and to avoid that the development in the countries could take the same path as it was the case in the developed countries with all the effects that we know. It's also the question of financing, of mitigation, because we know that in the COP 2024, the next COP, all the discussion of financing of the mitigation and the adaptation is a really big question also for especially for the developing countries. So I think that I will stop here in my comments. I would like only to highlight the fact that you asked or to propose a better cooperation between OECD and cooperation. I mean, more with OECD and UNCTAD, it's the case. Probably we can do more in order to influence or try to put in the OECD speech and figures an element of the interest of the developed countries through the interest of the developing countries. So it's something that we try to do regularly, even if, of course, it depends which are your interlocutors and in which places you can do that. But it's something that we have to develop in order to not only to work between us, but also to influence the way to think in OECD, which is probably absolutely useful and urgent. Well,
thank you. Okay, so now I would like, if there's anyone who would like to comment on anything that's been said. Yes.
I'm with the World Alliance Against Antibiotic Resistance, and I noted in the World Investment Forum that you're organizing in October, you've decided to put AMR, antimicrobial resistance, on the agenda. And it bears very much on the issue of what you just mentioned, which is the resilience of healthcare systems. And on the way it is on the agenda, it seems like it's only some legal advisor from UNCTAD who is going to speak on public support for private investments. And I was wondering if it's possible for civil society to have a voice, as coming from the development, health, and finance economics standpoint, if it's possible for us to have a voice on that issue, again, in the World Investment Forum, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. We've taken your question. We'll take that to the division. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Shekla. I represent the Housing and Land Rights Network of Habitat International Coalition based in Cairo, Egypt. And one of the things that concerns our membership is exactly what's been said by colleagues, and I want to especially thank the Deputy Secretary General for mentioning the human rights treaties and how they relate to state obligations that are not reflected in the SDGs. And in fact, we're seeing through the SDGs and other mechanisms a retreat from state obligations in general and supplanting them with voluntary mechanisms that have no enforcement. But beyond the human rights treaties, there are a number of international norms and legal regimes that are evaded in the SDGs. And I just want to refer to one paragraph in the resolution, Transforming Our World, that encompasses, in fact, some of these issues of illicit financial flows, illicit arms flows, corruption, and also the problem, well, the violation of colonization and the denial of self-determination. This paragraph 35 claims that these issues are addressed in the 2030 agenda. However, there are no corresponding goals, targets, or indicators, and many of the indicators are in fact quite static, not calling for action, change, or certainly not measurable processes or changes. So we just share this concern with all parties, but especially the concern that SDGs not be seen as a supplantation of treaty obligations and state obligations, including extraterritorial obligations.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard, yes.
Given that I guess it's my item. Just, I mean, thank you for the various comments on the paper, most of which I agree with. Obviously, the paper is framed around the notion of illicit financial flows, so that stacks the way in which we address this particular problem. I don't think it's the case that we're trying to bend the discussion more towards the private sector. The notion that the private sector will deliver the SDGs is based on a series of false assumptions. The most obvious one being that the public sector has, over the last 30 years, been starved of resources. And I don't know where the 15% figure comes from. What the exercise that we carried out in the TDR this year was a very simple one. We asked the question, what if we went back to the kind of taxation system that was in place in the good old days of Richard Nixon? Seems like a long time ago now, I know, but it seems like a bit of a golden age in many respects. And so if you take the kind of tax structure that was present under Nixon and comparable administrations in the late 60s, early 1970s, it is extremely simple to generate $1 to $2 trillion per year of extra resources to fund the kinds of investments that we're talking about in the SDGs. This is not a complicated technical exercise, and it shouldn't be, given Nixon's own political inclinations, it shouldn't really be a complicated political exercise either. So the idea, and indeed, the other side of this story is that, and the difference with the Nixon era, of course, is that our era is, unlike the designers of multilateralism, the original multilateral system, and this is an important thing because it connects with the previous discussion, this is an era of recklessly unregulated finance. And the promise of recklessly unregulated finance was that that would be good for investors, that it would help to enhance private sector investment in the things that we want in the real economy. Unfortunately, the evidence points in the opposite direction. That is, a world of unregulated finance has not only been bad for public sector investment, it's been very bad for private sector investment. So if you take the trends on private sector investment across the global economy, both developed and developing, over the course of with one big exception, one big country that is an exception to this rule, you will see that in unregulated financial systems, private sector investment tends to go down for reasons that we know about. It's highly speculative, it's short-termist, etc. And so, unlike the world when trade was an engine of growth, that is, in the period between 1945 and 1980, when trade was an engine of growth, the world today does not have the kind of prerequisites that are required for that engine to be working, because in the original multilateral trading system, trade acted as an engine of growth under certain conditions. If you had full employment, trade could be seen as an engine of growth. We don't live in a full employment world anymore. If you have regulated finance, then trade can act as an engine of growth. If you live in an unregulated financial world, trade can act as a reinforcement of polarization and uneven development. If you have workers' rights, then trade can act as an engine of growth. If you have long-term capital flows, then trade can act as an engine of growth. Interestingly enough, those were all the features of the multilateral agenda that was being developed in the period from 1945 to 1950, culminating in the promotion of the Havana Charter, that said trade only acts as an engine of growth if we live in a full employment world, if we have long-term capital flows, if we have workers' rights, and if developing countries are allowed to diversify and industrialize their economies. That was the agenda of the Havana Charter that was ultimately rejected by the US Senate, and parts of which became the GATT rules. The developing countries were never happy with the final outcome, of course. I mean, if you again, a simple bit of history. UNCTAD was not created simply out of a defender of the multilateral rules. It was created because it didn't think the rules that were in place in the 1950s were sufficient to help developing countries grow and catch up. So in 1958, if people might have forgotten, that's 60 years ago, the Habeler report was commissioned by by what was then the GATT, because developing countries were not happy with the way in which the trade rules were operating as more and more developing countries became independent. So the Habeler report was the first attempt under GATT rules to introduce development into the international trading system. 60 years later, they're still trying to do it. And not very successfully, if the Doha development round is anything to go by. And of course, the consequence of the failures of the Habeler report to take development seriously led to what? It led to UNCTAD, because that was the origins of UNCTAD. As developing countries became more and more frustrated with the inability of the rules-based system to deal with development, they organized to create an organization like UNCTAD, which is what happened, because we didn't like the rules, the multilateral rules, as they were then currently established. And it's our job as an institution not simply to promote a rules-based system, but to promote a rules-based system that works for development. That's the name of the game. That's what we were set up to do. And at this point in time, we clearly have a rules-based system that doesn't do that. And so the question then is not only in finance, trade, and technology, which are the three big drivers of the international division of labour, we need to think very hard about what kind of rule, crudely we need to think very hard, what kind of rules do we need to allow more developing countries to do what China has done? That's the simple challenge that most developing countries face, because they want to do what China did. That is, they want to take millions of people out of poverty, diversify their economies into higher level, more productive sectors and industrial activities. And we're not there. We don't have a set of rules that allows us to do that, at least according to Donald Trump. We have a set of rules that if you want to do that, you have to break them. Because apparently, according to the United States administration, the only way to do what China does today is to break the rules. So we have to think very hard about the kind of rules that are currently in place, and whether it's in finance or trade or technology or intellectual property, whether those rules are genuinely providing the space in which developing countries can catch up and diversify their economies in a systemic kind of way. So I think that's my comment.
Thank you, Richard. For anyone who doesn't know, Richard Kaiser-Wright is the director of our division on globalization and development strategies. So I'm going to move quickly to the third theme, because we have a speaker who needs to leave right after he speaks, and then we will, again, there'll be a chance to talk after. But I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to Reverend Emmanuel Saint-Louis, who is the president of the Conseil mondial des congrès diplomatiques des aumôniers pour la paix universelle des droits humains et juridiques.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Saint-Louis, the president of NGO, Conseil mondial du congrès diplomatique des aumôniers pour la paix universelle, droits humains et juridiques, Congress of Diplomatic Chaplain for Universal Human Rights and Peace and Justice. I have a question before I'm starting with my subject. And then, for future of trade, technology to bridge trade, finance gap, and accelerate CME growth. My question is, in my question there is 4 points. Excuse me, please, for my English. How we can bring the changing nature of global trade. My first point, how we can bring the changing nature of global trade. And second, the impact of the impact on digitalization. And 3, bridging the gap in trade finance. And last, shaping the future of sustainability in trade. Ladies and gentlemen, the number of devices connected to the Internet will exceed 15 billion by 2020. According to CISO's forecast made in 2017, which estimate that 40 trillion devices will be integrated into the global network in 20 years, thanks to advances in digital technology areas such as artificial intelligence, electronic medicine, security, and education have already made spectacular advances. The Internet is not only a network and technology. It's first and foremost a tool for relationships, communications, and entrepreneurship. For this advance to remain, okay, thank you. Excuse me. For this advance to remain in the private sector only constitutes a real handicap in our society. This continuous and omnipresent link causes billions of daily exchange that circumnegate the world. The consequences and implications of this data sharing are unimaginable. One thing is certain. Everything connected will be one on the major drivers of digital growth, and the positive benefit that data sharing can bring to people's lives are evident in some of the most connected societies in the world. For the moment, in Haiti, the priority remains access to drinking water, electricity, housing care, and education for all. Freedom and human dignity begin with a root. Please, can you raise over? Yeah. Okay. Can I, excuse me. Wait for a stop. Freedom and human dignity begin with a roof, food, and so on, but I also believe that access to the Internet has become a global necessity, and Haiti and some area of Africa is no exception to the rule, especially as it today has the potential to become a breeding ground for digital innovation in the Caribbean and somewhere in the Southwest Africa. At the level of our public administration, digital technology should enable us to invite a new generation of public, open and transparent service. However, this can only be done in our country is connected by a very high-speed internet network. The digital world with its tools such as computer and smartphone is now an integral part of our daily lives and will develop in the coming years. Digital transformation refers to the process by which all new technology are integrated. The digital transformation is not a new concept since it has existed since the start of the Internet. For example, the normalization of email in employee daily lives is one of the most obvious examples of this technological revolution in the corporate world. 70% of the world's population now has a mobile phone, a major force in the digital transformation of public and private institutions. It is impossible for them to ignore this reality. Moreover, some pioneers such as Uber have built their business model on the mobile phone, focusing on some of its assets such as geolocation and real time. On the changing nature of work due to new technology, the agricultural sector, which is prominent in developing countries, is not left behind by the move to mobile. On the contrary, economic studies conducted by the James Ma Association of GMS Operators have shown its role in improving the effectiveness of agricultural market. In India, for example, the use of mobile phones allow fishermen to sell fish where they are offering the best price. The same was observed in Niger, where cereal farmers were able to increase the number of customers and thus their income. In the end, better dissemination of information favors trade of a large geographical area. This effect is even stronger when the markets are distant or poorly connected by transport infrastructure. The gains made by the agricultural sector are strongly related to the influence of mobile communication over transportation. The main impact lies in its substitution for transport infrastructure. Mobile telephony makes it possible to avoid long and costly trips, expanding up the dissemination of information. The above example could easily be applied in Haiti and sub-Saharan country of Africa. The digital challenge is a human challenge. It's essential to promote the digital profession to young people and to support the transformation of traditional trades. Is it up to men to adapt to new technology and not the other way around? Each of must be ready to take the plunge if it does not want to miss the digital transformation trend. In this context, we must promote change management that allow administrative structure to evolve toward greater efficiency and transparency. In the context of the fight against corruption, one of the actions will be to make public calls to tender accessible to everyone via the internet. Another action could be possibility of having access to all public service online, which would have the effect of eliminating waiting times and potential intermediary. The same goes to all custom declaration or the creation of reliable data for all civil servants, which would reduce financial corruption. In the medium term, innovation will enable us to embark on path to effective and credibility public administration amid providing new projects and services to their citizens. Public authorities and private companies must open up to new technology by enabling young people to develop innovative tools that benefit the local economy. Public bodies would play the role of talent incubator and value-added producer for this economy. In addition, telecommunication infrastructure owner in Haiti or Africa in software, Africa must be encouraged to continue to invest in building better networks to outpace demand in this area of digital innovations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your statement, and very much appreciated given that I understand you have to rush to the airport quite soon. My apologies for having to step out of the room earlier on. Very happy to be back now. We can now move on to the next speaker, and just a reminder of the theme, it's building resilience to multiple shocks affecting people and sustainable development. Next up, we have Philippe Egger, who is the President of Development, Innovations and Networks. Sorry, Philippe.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to UNCTAD for this invite. I speak on behalf of Development, Innovations and Networks, which is a Geneva-based NGO representing several hundred peasant organizations and cooperatives. Resilience to multiple shocks is a long chapter in the study of multiple studies, including of the UN. But our conviction is that this is best built through a very strong agricultural sector, ensuring productive employment to smallholders and providing the basis for broad-based economic growth. Africa in particular needs to produce more food to feed its growing population. It also needs to provide better employment for the large majority working in agriculture and earning their living from agriculture. Enabling Africa and more generally LDCs to combine these two objectives, produce more food and generate more productive employment, is a strategic issue for the region and for the world. It is obviously possible to grow more food without generating more employment, and there are examples of this around the world. It is also possible, obviously, to generate employment in activities other than agriculture, in manufacturing and services. But the broad reality is that one of stagnating smallholder agriculture, rising urban underemployment, and soaring food imports. This is not a very sustainable pattern. A far better combination for sustained growth and resilient economies is to combine the focus on smallholder agriculture and on productive employment. As mentioned, these trends are well documented in many reports, including in successive UNCTAD LDC reports, reports on economic development in Africa, and in the very well-done report of 2015 on smallholder agriculture. The future of productive employment in Africa rests largely on the performance of smallholder agriculture. Many policy commitments have been entered into, but the weak link is policy implementation. Particularly weak is consultations and cooperation with representative peasant organizations. What more could UNCTAD contribute in these areas? 5 points are suggested. First, to better monitor trends in agriculture output and employment by landholding size. UNCTAD publishes data on the first two, agriculture output and agriculture employment, but not by landholding size. Second, to document more frequently successful cases where smallholder agriculture has set off broad-based development. Third, promote policy dialogues on investments in smallholder agriculture, including rural infrastructure. Fourth, engage in broad policy consultations with governments, private sector, and representatives of peasant organizations. And fifth, continue to examine the special situation of agriculture in global, regional, and bilateral trade agreements, especially with regard to their impact on smallholder agriculture. And several speakers have already mentioned the difficulties in that area. In all these areas, UNCTAD could expand its work and its collaboration with other UN organizations, as well as with the NGO community. Our small organization is making a range of contributions in these areas. It recently has organized a joint workshop with UNCTAD on agriculture and employment in Africa with funding from the Geneva Development Cooperation Federation. One of our members, Deogracias Nyonkuru of Burundi, has just published a book, I have a copy here, under the title in French, Pour la dignité paysanne, in which he reflects on his experience treading smallholder farms and villages for over 30 years. It is a sobering account of what has gone wrong and how one could make it right. We commend UNCTAD for the excellence of its analysis on topical issues. We encourage UNCTAD to expand its outreach and engage with all stakeholders in policy dialogues and consultations over the implementation of policies that could lead to more productive employment and higher performance smallholder agriculture. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Philippe. So moving swiftly on, we'll now go to Stefano Prato, who was introduced to you before, but just as a reminder, Stefano is Managing Director of the Society for International Development. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. If I'm allowed just 1 second on the previous paper, because there's something on behalf of the Civil Society FFD group which is quite important. I mean, many of my colleagues pointed out on the importance of the Global UN Tax Commission, which for us is one of our fundamental advocacy asks. But in the policy proposals that you put forward at the end of the paper, there are two issues we're nervous about. One is that you seem to be speaking about a convention before a forum is established, which I think is problematic because the key point for us is the fact that you need to advance the process of democratization of economic governance when it comes to tax cooperation. And therefore, the forum can hardly come after the convention. Without the forum, it's difficult to negotiate the convention. And the second part is that this idea of delinking transparency, disentangling transparency from tax is also problematic, because we feel that the two issues are very closely interconnected and cannot be decoupled. So, just small things. I can't elaborate now, but it's very important, I think, for our entire group to be very sensitive about this thing. And while we appreciated the paper, that last paragraph was somehow an element of concern. Now, let me get on the issue of building resilience. And I'm going to have to raise an issue on the document. And not because I have a problem in building resilience, but because I have a problem with compacting altogether one concept of resilience against particular climate or other, let's say, shocks that we cannot control, and of which the only strategy is to build the capacity of our communities to be resilient against, and including into that a number of other shocks which actually, where our focus, our concern, should not be one of increasing resilience, but decreasing vulnerability. Now, this seems a little mental trick, but it's not, because the whole point is when we put the message out in terms of building resilience against financial shock and other types of shocks, the message we're giving is you're on your own. We have basically abdicating our attempt to redirect the system, so the only thing you have to do, find shelter. And I think that's a problematic message. And I think maybe there's a little bit of thinking in the framing. It's certainly not UNCTAD's, I don't think it's UNCTAD proposition, but it may actually somehow be read or be somehow an element of a narrative in that direction, which is somehow problematic. And in fact, when we're increasingly talking about social protection over the past period, nobody can speak against social protection, but at the same time, to what extent this is an acceptance that marginalization is a structural component of our socio-economic systems. We need to, there's a fine line in addressing a necessity, an important need, and then promoting through that narrative its social and moral acceptability. And I think we don't want to get there. So I think it's important maybe to refine language here a little bit. Two just additional quick concepts, because I think we're running out of time. One is I was a little bit unhappy with the fact that women are addressed in the paper as a part of vulnerable population. I think that's fundamentally a problem. And it's also fundamentally wrong. Let's remember that unpaid work is the largest subsidy to the global economy. So there's nothing to be vulnerable about that. It's actually an element of exploitation. It's not an element of vulnerability. And the other dimension is particularly at the times of crisis, not only because care burden is increased, but also because austerity has very often affected women more than other constituency. Women have been the most important counter-cyclical support to crisis. So I think for these and for a set of other reasons, I think that's not a proper locus for addressing the women and the gender question in the context of the paper. Very last, the paper speaks about economic diversification as a way to strengthen domestic economies. That's fine, but it's just a little bit weak, once again. As I mentioned in the previous intervention, the fundamental focus has to become the shift of the central gravity of economic strategies towards the local and the national. And in that context, of course, understand how them help rebuild social foundations of societies that extreme delocalization have somehow weakened. Because the relation between the producers and the consumers, between the workers and the employers, have been a little lost in that very extreme vertical specialization that also certain trade regimes have pushed for. So the concept is, again, as also Richard was mentioning, what rules, what systems, what reaffirmation of rights enable that shift to take place. And in that, we will build much more resilient social societies and economies in which we can begin to break new paths, particularly when it comes to circular economies and agroecological transitions. But if we do not create that system of rules that allow for that space, for that policy direction, that is very difficult, and the discussion on resilience, this fundamentally Keynes sound, has an abdication of responsibility for a system that have simply decided to leave a number of people out. Thank you.
Many thanks, Stefano.
I would like to react.
Yes, I was going to say, before moving on to the next speaker, we'll ask the Deputy Secretary
I think that
to
it's
react.
important to, well, not to react. I think to dialogue between us, because I fully agree with you. It's not a question of abdication and only make regarding the situation of the people, we only think at see at the situation. It's a question of the chicken and the egg. Which are the roots, which are the consequences. Of course, women are vulnerable, not because they are vulnerable, because of exploitation, of situation of the woman, the rights of the woman, etc. So probably I have to reread the paper in order to look at this perception, because it's absolutely no doubt. Of course, resilience. What means resilience? Resilience means the capacity of the communities, the national people, the government, etc., to react to a situation. But it requests global rules. It requests the changing, but you cannot wait for the changing and not react directly after. You see the women exploitation, you see about the hurricane or climate change, or all those things. Climate change is also something that we can control if we want. If there is a political will to change the developing approach in each country, especially in developed countries, if we change our way to work on CO2 and all those things, of course we can not reverse, but well mitigate at least at minimum level the climate change consequences on the countries. So I would like to reread it in order to look at that, because I'm a little bit shocked with, not shocked, but I understand what you mean. It's absolutely not okay. That's the system. It's like that. Social protection and social problems are a fatality, and the only thing that we can do is help the people more or less to restart or to restand the situation. Absolutely not. Of course, we have to help to that directly and concretely, because it's the request of the countries and our clients, if I can say, the LDC countries in so difficult situation are asking for support to do something after shocks directly on short term. But the reaction on the middle and long term is absolutely absent of the resilience. The resilience is also, well, to change, to transform economy, to rebuild economic resilience, diversification, etc. And so I wouldn't like to, or at least to say that, because I think that I would not need to be bad perceived, but I will read the text with your eyes in order to look if it's really that, and I will moderate this session in the TDB, and I can assure you that it's absolutely not my goal to say, okay, that's a fatality. It's more that we will ask to the different panelists, which are your experience? If we have in front of us the ambassador of Mali with all the terrorist question, Boko Haram and all those things, how, of course, we can change the system, and we have to change the system. But when we are confronted with Boko Haram in your country, in the post-conflict situation, etc., your situation regarding economic diversification and rights, etc., of course, you have to have some measure or some support, very concrete, dedicated to this specific problem. When you discuss with a small island after a hurricane, okay, I can speak about the changing of the system, but I have also to solve and to give some support, not only humanitarian support, but how could you, on short term, reverse situation regarding all the people without a house, without all the crops are completely destroyed, etc., etc. So I think that it's not one of the other. It's, well, of course, the global analysis, what you explained, the more shorter analysis on short term, how do you help for the resilience, but helping not only with humanitarian system, well, of course, that's useful in the first step, but it's not enough. How do you change your economy, your social system, and your economic growth or strategy after this kind of shocks on a more long-term basis? So, but I will read the text.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move on to the next speaker on our list, Daniel Bertosa, Director of Policy and Governance at Public Services International. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thank you. I must echo Stefano's slight discomfort with the paper. I read it and I struggled to find specific things to critique, but at the end of it I did have a feel that the cutting up of the risks into very discrete pieces led to some conclusions that undermined the more general possibilities and options for building resilience. And I'll discuss Ebola and I'll discuss terrorism, but there are, when a government finds itself in the face of a shock, an unexpected shock, the ability of it to have built its resilience in advance impacts critically on the way in which it's able to deploy its resources and take action at that time. And to look at those crises circumstances without some deeper discussion about the systemic approaches leaves you a little bit unsatisfied. So allow me to make some specific points. The first is that there is a general need to build capacity to plan and coordinate in any crisis response. And that requires strong central government. And this is often attacked when times are good as bureaucracy or a waste of public resources. But the absence of that ability to plan and coordinate in advance is critical when a shock hits. Similarly, the ability to coordinate between a central government and local government is absolutely critical. And that often means for, in the developing world, a well-funded tier of local government. It is often the local circumstances that are critical. It's often the local knowledge that saves lives in the first few days of a natural disaster. It's often the ability to understand those circumstances that are critical. Yet too often we see municipal government underfunded. It's simply not receiving the transfers from central government because of a vertical fiscal imbalance. And it's critical. We saw it with Ebola in West Africa when we saw that in countries that had higher level of health investment but more fragmented health systems because they weren't centrally planned and controlled, their ability to deal with Ebola was much worse. Trust and social dialogue, absolutely critical, and faith in institutions. Again, we saw with Ebola some of the worst problems with the Ebola, not the worst problems, there was a lot of loss of life, but some of the biggest factors that led to tragedy was a lack of trust amongst the community in the public health officials as they attempted to go about their work to mitigate the crises, including public health workers being attacked and chased out of town. We also saw that these workers weren't involved. And I think the involvement of workers in your systems and in your government cannot be underestimated. Again, with Ebola, it was the workers through their trade unions who were trying to alert the global community to the Ebola crisis 3 months before it was acknowledged by the international organisations. And these workers through the unions knew about it because they were the organisations that had people dying in the most remote areas of Ebola-affected West Africa. And because these unions were not legally recognised, because these workers did not have trade union rights, often they were not being paid, they were simply ignored for 2 or 3 months. And that exacerbated the crisis because the basic premises of social dialogue simply were not in place in some of those countries. And similarly, the commitment. We had 600 of our members died in the Ebola crisis. The majority of them were not provided with basic protective equipment, were not paid for their work, were working unpaid, and were denied their basic trade union rights. You can't buy that level of commitment. Those workers continue to work in the face of that adversity. You can't buy that through a market. You can't pay someone enough to do that. They continue to work because they had a commitment to the public good, and they were part of a public system that fostered that commitment. I've spoken before. Well, I'd encourage you to look at the recommendations from the ILO tripartite experts meeting, which happened just a month and a half ago at the ILO on decent work in public emergency services. For a range of reasons, it comes to a lot of this work. But it says two things very clearly. One is that there should be no austerity, no cuts in services that deal with these areas, because they make sense when things are going well, but they're tragic when they don't. And the second is there should be no privatisation. And I say this is a tripartite body. This is employers, employees and governments who all agree that this is the case. And it's very simple, because these services, when they're provided by the private sector, are simply not reliable when you need them. Poor for-profit services are in the wrong place because they chase profit. They're not adaptive because the contracts are written in a way that envisages a certain stability, and when crises hit, they can't be adapted quickly enough to deal with them. They don't target the most vulnerable. And to just give, again, another example, and I use this example because it's fascinating. It's got to do with Germany. The PPPs are often promoted as a way of compensating for a lack of government capacity, as if you don't need government capacity to run a public-private partnership, as if a private sector company is not going to take advantage of a lack of capacity in a government in running a public-private partnership and extract maximum value out of that lack of capacity. So in Germany, the public-private partnership for the new airport was abandoned. The concert hall in Hamburg, which was promised at 114 million, was finally delivered for 780 million. There's been a wave of energy remunicipalisations all across Germany, and total rents for schools in Offenbach have increased from the initial forecast of 780 million to 1.3 billion. Now, when some of the most rich and developed countries in the world, and I quote Germany on purpose, it has a reputation for strong, capable, efficient and rational government, can't manage and oversee their PPPs in the public interest, what hope do the countries have when they're being encouraged to be involved in PPPs because they lack public capacity? And I think UNCTAD has a very real role in raising this and then assisting governments to develop that capacity, because when they have the capacity, they don't need the PPPs. Financial shocks, I echo Stefano's views about the issues around trade. Trade encourages specialisation. I mean, the theory of trade says that you reap the economic benefits because countries can specialise and then they trade and then they reap the benefit of that transaction. But if you're encouraging a system where there's increased specialisation, you're moving away from the idea of a diversification in your economy. I think that needs to be acknowledged and understood. There are also aspects of trade agreements that restrict public policy making. And I won't go into all of them, but when we're talking about financial shocks, restrictions on capital flows are the obvious ones. And I think that it's concerning. Debt, it's interesting that debt is mentioned in the introduction, but then is not dealt with in any substance in the body of the paper. And I think debt workout mechanisms are absolutely critical. And I note that the Secretary-General mentioned that in his opening remarks. I mean, the main reason that debt workout mechanisms are so brutal is that they're written by the creditors. They don't take the interests of society into account. And it's an irony that the vulture funds do so well from debt crises when they have no productive arm, the people that profit most from these crises. And the Argentinian example I was going to raise, and the way in which the vulture funds were able to cripple Argentina at the time is a tragedy. I mean, the United Nations General Assembly adopted resolutions on principles to guide sovereign debt in 2015. I think more can be done to promote those. We think they're good. I think environmental disasters are going to increase. I think we know that. Water and climate disasters account for up to 40% of GDP loss in middle-income countries. Market mechanisms don't allow us to prepare better. Certainly the preparation parts don't. What we need is the ability to set, finance and enforce policies and regulations in ways that make those environmental disasters less critical. So land use policy, deforestation, for example, urban planning and zoning are very critical. Water extraction is very critical. Building codes, our ability to have first responders, the list goes on. So I guess if there was anything, it would be to encourage a consideration of some of the underlying factors, some of the factors that if they got right will assist regardless of whether it's an environmental crisis, a financial crisis, a natural disaster. There are certain parts of building up the state that just build the ability of all of these specifics to be carried out. We would particularly talk about health. We think health is important. We'd talk about infrastructure development again, and also the building of robust institutions. We'd encourage you to consider the role of social dialogue, and particularly the way in which workers are included in these mechanisms. It's something the ILO's looked at, and we think a partnership there would be useful.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I don't know if the Deputy Secretary-General would like to react to that immediately.
Thank you for your remarks, because I think that it's really, well, you touched the center of the things, and of course the shocks are more or less, and it depends on the shocks, but the prevention of the shock is, of course, what about environment and landing using, etc., water problems, climate change, etc. Even some other crises could be prevented if, on the national or local or international community, you are adopting some rules, but also enforced or reinforce the capacity for the national government or local governments to take the measure regarding the prevention of those shocks. So that's first things. There was no so many shocks. We are completely without any capacity to prevent it. Even the tsunami in Thailand, we will have the ambassador of Thailand on that. Well, the link between tsunami and climate change, well, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. But in any case, the question of the population exposed and the building of hotel on the beach, etc., all those things are now regulated after, but I know how many people lost their life, and also the workers and the savers and all the assistance workers, etc. So it's why I think that the link between the long term and the prevention and the shocks, that's related to the first question of your colleague about the chicken and the egg. We have to work on both. To finish, because I think that I have to leave because I have a call conference with the TDB president in Moldavia at 5:15, so I have to go. I would like to thank you for this contribution, because even if sometimes a little bit theoretical, a little bit your position, and I understand it very well, you are NGO organization of the civil society trying to advocate it, to influence on base of your point of view or your angle of view. And I think that it's very useful that you continue to do that, even if sometimes UNCTAD could not have the possibility or not to support all the strategy that you want to accelerate, because we are a conference, because we are depending of our bodies, we are depending of our governments, which are our boss. So more or less we have to find a balance. The Mafichiano, which is our mandate, we have to respect it. It's our mandate. It's like that in the UN. I was minister in a previous life. I know the difference between the capacity, more or less, of a minister with all the constraints that you have, and the capacity of a UN body with the constraint of an addition of all the constraints of the national governments and the national choice. After each election it could change. So in this complex situation, I think that your contribution as NGO is really interesting to help us, or to encourage, or to enhance, highlight, reinforce some aspects that you feel a little bit not enough respected or taken into account. You have also to know that, of course, maybe all the NGOs not in the room are probably a different point of view. That's life, that's democracy and freedom of speech, and we have to, it's why I think that it's important also to diversify, and I think that we have to continue this dialogue, not only just before the TDB, but after, with you, with maybe a broader company of people accredited, wanted to dialogue and to discuss also between you, because of course it's complex for each of us. For NGO, you have also to take into account a lot of constraints, and well, you are not elected, so you are, and that's your basement is your organization or a trade union. Well, you have some accountability or the less direct accountability, but, well, whatever is the system, I think that listen to this, what emerged in the civil society is really important. And what emerged also in the new civil society. I conclude with that because I feel, especially in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries, that the traditional model of civil society is also changing. And with full respect for you and for me, I think that we have also to take into account new movements appearing, emerging in the developing and developed countries, probably differently organized than us in all previous system, more sometimes temporary. They are emerged and then maybe they disappear, so it's different. It's the young generation. I hope that we could have in this room people from 20 years old representing from Africa, from Asia, from USA or the part of the world, but representing a little bit the new generation. How do they think? How do they, as citizens, as civil society, and new forms of civil society? So I think that this dialogue could be really fruitful for you and for us. But I thank you for your contribution. I know that you have also some channels, direct channels in the organization in order also to work with staff sometimes in order to improve or try to highlight some aspect, and it's very well done. Help us also to disseminate reports, because writing a report, very nice. After that, the cycle, the report, the story is only beginning. It's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story. But how could we are not sometimes maybe not enough concentrated on the dissemination. You are in capacity to disseminate, probably not better than us, but with us, regarding the capacity to use properly and an appropriate way in the good places, in the good fora, the useful fora, not only the fora between us, we agree, okay, it's good. But after that, how do we convince and do we change in some places and some moments with this report in order to help and to enlarge the number of people that we can try to convince or have more alliance with other NGOs, with other organizations, even with organizations who we disagree. Sometimes you could disagree with some organization, but having some alliance on some concrete things on that, okay, that's a common goal. We continue even if we disagree on other aspects. So I think that all this strategy, in order to not only to have good analysis between us, but to try to improve the scale of our capacity to advocacy and maybe associated new partners in this discussion could be useful for the future. So I thank you for your contribution. It's registered. It's on we keep all the things. A summary will be done. We will try maybe to use it with the moderator in the TDB, because we are before the TDB, so maybe we can give some instruction to the moderator in each panel in order to put some aspect of your remarks in the moderation in order to, after that, we can evaluate that after, but I think that our way to work is so important and maybe so important as only the content. How do we not only explain between us what we are thinking, but how we use this matter and this capacity to change, to help to change or to move in the good direction regarding the Mafichiano, the member states, and all the concerns that a new organization as us have to take into account. So thank you for that, and see you later.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Secretary General. So we will now pursue the discussion. We'll stay on this theme before moving to the theme of industrial policies. I'd like to invite Sudhanshu Saranwala, the Executive Director of Communications and Marketing at WWF International, to make a statement.
Thank you. So I represent WWF International. We are an international NGO based in about 100 countries as an environmental and conservation organization. So thank you for the note. We welcome the note by UNCTAD and the opportunity and the space for this consultation. I just want to make a few points and perhaps re-stress some of the points that were made here already. So nature, biodiversity, and ecosystem services underpin the implementation of the SDGs. So this collective, these goals together represent a comprehensive approach, and they're not really cherry-picked. So if we look at it combined, the role of nature in this is not to be underestimated. And there's enough evidence to show that nature continues to decline, and with that, the capacity of nature to support sustainable development also suffers and in terms of maintaining resilience. So just to re-stress the point around reducing risk as crucial and critical, it's as critical as building resilience. And I think that that point can't be made enough, and we need to be able to reflect that. So protecting nature and restoring and reversing its loss will help prevent environmental shocks from occurring in the first place and reduce exposure to them. So just going into your section 1, a couple of quick comments there. There is clear evidence that protecting, managing, and restoring nature and ecosystem services helps mitigate climate change and reduces the risk of environmental shock. And therefore, while your typology is useful, we would therefore like to see the analysis of the causes of environmental shock expanded. So climate change plays a crucial role, but so does the loss and degradation of nature. And it would be great to be able to see that reflected. As we look into the section 2 in terms of building resilience to multiple shocks, for the economic diversification, of course, we agree that the equity issues are an important concern. For the circular economy, the approaches are good, but should be complemented with measures related to efficiency, for example, energy, waste, example, food, and overexploitation and sustainable resource management. Coming to infrastructure, the key here is about sustainable infrastructure and the investment in that it should integrate environmental, social, and governance aspects into a project planning, into the building and the operating phases. And it should consider both its contribution to climate change and nature loss and the degradation and impact of climate change on the infrastructure itself. And 3, that it's designed to enhance ecosystem resilience and climate change adaptation. So the finance sector can promote sustainable infrastructure through actions by integrating sustainability in decision-making, demonstrate the sustainable business opportunity, and scale up sustainable infrastructure. And the final point is around natural capital approaches should be used for infrastructure development decisions, and as we look in international frameworks to promote green finance, to properly assess climate and nature-related risks, and lastly, to properly incorporate natural capital accounting approaches in decision-making. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the areas that we've been looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to see now, is there anybody else who would like to take the floor on this issue, or would we want to move on to the next and final theme? I suggest, given that we're running behind the clock a bit, we should probably move on to the next thing. So we will now be looking at the last issue, which is industrial policies and productive capacity policies for a digital economy. I'd like to invite our first speaker, Sanya Smith, legal advisor from Third World Network. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And as the Secretary-General said earlier today, e-commerce, the concept, is different to rules being proposed in the name of e-commerce at the World Trade Organization, because we know today that e-commerce, the concept, is thriving. $22 trillion a year is already taking place in e-commerce without any new rules on e-commerce at the WTO. And so if we're looking at the relationship between digital economy, industrial policy, WTO e-commerce rules, of course governments have many considerations to balance, including to achieve the SDG on industrialization. And as UNCTAD economists have shown us, all of today's industrialized economies, except Hong Kong, industrialized via infant industry tariff protection, where you put tariffs on your competing imports when you're first starting your own industry, and then as your own industry develops economies of scale and so on, you can reduce the tariffs on competing imports. So today's industrializing countries, developing countries, LDCs, still need tariffs on imports. But what we see in the WTO in the name of e-commerce is that the US is proposing that all WTO members, including least developed countries, raise their de minimis. And the de minimis means that everything below that, the imports come in tariff-free, zero tariffs. So in the US, the de minimis is $800, which buys a lot in developing countries and LDCs. And when some countries raised their de minimis, what they found was that importers cut up the shipments so that they all come in below the de minimis. So then you get a tariff revenue loss, and it undermines the ability to use tariffs as infant industry protection, including to protect your domestic producers who may be small and medium enterprises. So it's important that this aspect of the implications of raising the de minimis is reflected in UNCTAD publications, for example, the e-trade readiness assessments. And a one-size-fits-all de minimis would also mean that least developed countries and developing countries do the same amount of liberalisation of tariffs on imports as developed countries. And this is against the less than full reciprocity and special and differential treatment rules at the WTO, especially when we're supposed to be in a development round at the moment. And then, of course, for normal industrialization occurring in a digital era, we need to take account of 3D printing. And so you may need tariffs on electronic transmissions, which is the way that products are now coming into your country as the plans are emailed across the border. But in the WTO, in the name of e-commerce, some countries are proposing a permanent ban on tariffs on e-transmissions, and there's an UNCTAD paper on the impact of this, including the impact on government revenue. So when we look at the UNCTAD paper prepared for the Trade and Development Board on this theme, it suggests that governments should use their government procurement to buy domestic products and services to stimulate industries in this sector. But in the name of e-commerce at the WTO, the EU has banned governments from directing their procurement to domestic products or services or companies for all ministries, for all goods and services, for all countries, including least developed countries, and even the $1 contracts. And of course, this government procurement is a Singapore issue which cannot be negotiated in the current Doha round, but has been proposed in the name of e-commerce, and there's a paper on this at the inside of the entrance. The UNCTAD paper also mentioned that we need to resolve the questions of data ownership and network effects due to first mover advantages, but again, the proposed e-commerce rules at the WTO would actually increase the dominance of big companies like Google, Amazon and Facebook, and again, there's papers on this inside the entrance. And the proposed rules in the WTO in the name of e-commerce, such as requiring cross-border data flows, would harm SMEs because it would give platforms like Amazon more power to continue squeezing SMEs to pay them high fees. And again, there's a paper on this inside the entrance. So we see that associations representing millions of SMEs have actually opposed the e-commerce rules at the WTO, and their statement is also inside the entrance. If we look at a digital industrialization paper, what is needed according to economists from the London School of Economics is that developing countries need access to the source code, the software, to do digital catch-up. But again, in the name of e-commerce at the WTO, developed countries are proposing a ban on requirements to transfer source code. And secondly, the paper recommended that if governments require data to be stored locally, this can force companies to invest in local servers and help promote a national internet industry. And this national data industry has many skilled and high-paid job opportunities, which helps develop your digital industry, including via clustering effects to support the emergence of high-tech capacity industries. But again, at the WTO, in the name of e-commerce, developed countries are proposing a ban on requiring data to be stored locally. So that digital industrialization path is also cut off. There's also an executive summary of another longer paper on digital industrialization inside the entrance. And of course, a basic underpinning factor that is needed for developing countries and LDCs to fully participate in the digital economy is to address the digital divide. Many countries still don't have electricity, broadband internet access, but when you look at the European Union's WTO e-commerce proposal, it says that if you want financial assistance for this, go to the World Bank, not the WTO. So it seems unlikely that even if e-commerce rules are negotiated in the WTO, that there will be enough new enforceable aid to electrify all the developing countries and LDCs and give everybody broadband internet access enough so they can actually participate in the digital economy and digital industrialization. And of course, The digital economy raises new and different regulatory challenges, so we may need different regulations to the non-digital sector, and we see that the e-commerce proposals at the WTO undermine regulations in at least 11 different ministries, including tax collection, exacerbating flash crashes on the stock market and so on, and again there's a paper inside the entrance on this. So lastly, on the role of UNCTAD in all of this, we hope that any outside experts used by UNCTAD, including on e-commerce and the digital economy, have a history of development expertise, rather than, say, IT industry lobbyists who don't have a development background. Because when it collaborates, UNCTAD as a development institution should collaborate with development experts, including on the digital economy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sanya. Next on our list, Rashid Kaukab, Executive Director of CUTS International.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start on a lighter vein by saying that my invisible hat is off to all those who still remain in this room. I can assure you that what they will hear in the remaining presentation, not by me, by others, would be what's their time here. I must also thank UNCTAD for Division on Technology and Logistics for preparing a good and balanced note on this agenda item. Let me start by saying a few words on the comeback of the industrial policy. Yes, industrial policies seem to be back in fashion, even in developed countries. It is realized that these policies have a role to play to develop and strengthen domestic industries and to ensure their competitiveness in international markets. When it comes to developing countries and LDCs, it is even more important because without sufficient industrial and manufacturing capacities, they face problems of unemployment, skills development, and over-reliance on commodities. The potential of their services sector too remains limited to lower ends of the value chain. In such conditions, the industrial policies are an attempt to build manufacturing and industrial capabilities which can result in job creation, structural transformation, and sustained growth. This is indeed a big task, which has been made even more challenging by the emergence of the digital economy. So now turning to the digital economy, it is true, it is a fact that digitalization of goods, services, tasks, enterprises, sectors, economies, and even societies is taking place. Although the magnitude can vary greatly based on the context and location. The dawn of this brave new world is exciting as well as daunting. Some present it, in the many debates going around on this issue, some present it as Aladdin's magic lamp that will fulfill all the needs and even dreams of humanity. Others view it as a Pandora's box that can let out unimaginable catastrophes. This debate is not going to end soon. What we should try to focus instead is to see and identify the ways to harness the potential to face the challenges, particularly for the growth and development of developing countries. Developing these local manufacturing and industrial base typically and has been a long time-consuming process, requiring foresight, consultations, resources, and monitoring. Now, taking into account the dimension added by digitalization, developing countries need to rethink their policies for industrial and productive capacity building. They need to undertake a comprehensive assessment of areas where such capacities can be built in conjunction with opportunities offered by digital economy. Turning to some of the prerequisites to tap the potential of digital economy, and these include, there's a long list, but some that are mentioned often are ICT infrastructure, access and usage of digital medium and digitally enabled devices, processing of data, customization of products and services to suit the requirements and paying capacity of users, and continuous innovation. To this, we must add fair competition, consumer protection, labor and gender sensitivity, and support to the marginalized. That will ensure inclusive and sustained growth and development. It is clear that crafting suitable industrial policies to build productive capacities in the digital age is not easy. There is no one-size-fits-all model or template. An overly prescriptive tone must be avoided because this is a fast-evolving situation. However, Certain elements do stand out. I'll mention 5, which the policies should focus on, and the tools of support and incentives under the policies should try to target at. 1, ICT infrastructure development. Then the second, human resources development. These are mentioned a lot and prerequisites, so I will not say much about that. But also technology and innovation development. And that's where the domestic technology and innovation capacity building is needed to ensure that the benefits of digitalization are reaped. Another very important area is regulatory development. I'm from a developing country, and it is a reality that regulatory architecture in developing countries is still for dealing with the issues of pre-digital age. Its upgrading is needed to meet the risks and requirements of the digital economy with respect to particularly user privacy, data protection, ethical uses of data, competition, and consumer protection, to name a few. Finally, the 5th point is the very important element of inclusive and sustainable development. One cannot ignore the issues and impacts related to gender, labor and employment, environment, and distribution. Quite the contrary. These should inform the design and implementation. The new age industrial policy, as this shows, is not one-dimensional. It needs to combine supply side with demand side, economic consideration with social and political goals, enabling environment with adequate regulations, hard infrastructure with skills development. This demands a holistic, careful, and inclusive approach. But this is what we must aim to do, because that is the only way that we should aim for if we hope for Aladdin's lamp in Pandora's box. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rashid. I really love the analogy there. I think we're going to borrow that from you. I'd like to move on now to Deborah James, again, from who's, just as a reminder, Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Deborah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak again here at UNCTAD. Our World is Not for Sale Network have been working extensively on issues of digital economy, and many of our members are experts in this field, and their papers are available on the table at the entrance. As we know, the role of UNCTAD is to build consensus around development-centered policies, and we're now speaking of doing this with regards to the future digital economy. We'd therefore like to make the primary point that we believe UNCTAD is the perfect place to discuss how developing countries can take advantage of the digital economy, but that it is entirely premature to be discussing rulemaking in the digital economy, be that in the WTO or in UNCTAD. So first off, it seems that developing countries have made their priorities quite clear as far as increased access to energy, the internet, other information and communications technologies to close the digital divide, increase infrastructure for logistics, including transportation and postal systems, legal and regulatory frameworks, access to finance and capacity building in all of these areas. And we commend the work of the technology division in their work assessing e-commerce readiness and helping developing countries close the digital divide and use e-commerce for their development. But clearly we don't know enough about the digital world of the future. And at this point, we all realize that there are vast opportunities for countries to take advantage of the digital economy for development. But it's not just about opportunities. We find that there are many, many more downside risks. The risks of the platforms and the first mover advantage in the digital sphere consolidating the dominance of Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Uber, etc., expose developing countries to significant risk, such as we are seeing today with Walmart purchasing Flipkart in India, while the other largest retailer in the country is Amazon. So the two largest retailers in India will be Walmart and Amazon. We can see many negative impacts from the loss of jobs, control of developing country economies by foreign firms, what can be termed digital colonialism, a lack of control over the most valuable resource, which is data, threats to privacy, facilitation of tax evasion, facilitating financial instability, the erosion of policy space for development, to name a few. I have a paper on the side where I go into 12 different of the negative sides of the idea of doing e-commerce rules. and the negative impacts for development. There seem to me to be two competing narratives then. One is that developing countries should jump on the e-commerce train and connect with the platforms as they have been envisioned by the firms of developed countries. And here, all aspects of production and systems of governance would be controlled by the platforms and developed countries. However, there is another development-centered narrative, and that is the narrative of digital industrialization. What is the alternative to Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon, I would ask? Does it exist in Europe, which is proposing rules on e-commerce in the WTO along with the United States? No, the only alternatives exist in China, which has pursued a different set of policies, including sheltering its market and supporting its domestic industries until they have become globally competitive. It can be seen as a mixed economy approach. And the idea then is not just about developing countries copying the Chinese model, but about using the set of trade and development tools that are tailored for various economies and thus focused on promoting domestic capacity. As Sonia mentioned, one of our members, IT for Change, based in India, has a paper on the side table on digital industrialization, which we commend, and it includes 5 basic elements of a sound digital industrial policy. Number 1, providing enabling legislative and regulatory frameworks. Number 2, supporting a startup ecology and other domestic digital businesses. Number 3, building public digital and data infrastructures, public data and digital infrastructures. Number 4, shaping regulatory frameworks for digital monopolies that are set to control whole sectors. And 5, developing public or community digital platforms in some key areas. Notice the emphasis on the public over the means of production of the data into intelligence, which is the key industry of the future. And we also commend the excellent work done by UNCTAD and particularly by Rashmi Banga on digital industrialization policy. So our biggest concern regarding the digital economy relates to jobs and growth. While we think that the hype about robots taking all of our jobs is a bit overblown, we are still very worried about the proposed e-commerce rules and the current dominance of platforms in leading to a reduction in jobs and growth while capturing more income for transnational corporations. The most important way that countries can ensure that the gains from the new digital economy are widely shared, given the potential for disruption in employment and jobs, is for countries to have a commitment to a full employment policy. This full employment should be accompanied by appropriate levels of social protection, which are unfortunately diminishing rather than increasing in developing and developed countries alike. Our other biggest concern regarding the digital economy relates to the control of data, and we think that there is some emphasis on that in the UNCTAD paper, but perhaps not enough given its importance. We know that it's the world's most valuable resource and that control of data will be the gateway to the control of economic production in the future. The nature of ownership of digital data, not just personal but also collective and community rights over metadata, must be clarified before any agreements should be made for developing countries to have cross-border data transfers and transfer this most valuable resource to transnational companies for free. There should also be an emphasis in the development of the digital economy in the context of the full employment of human rights. And in this, we speak not just of digital rights per se, but of the enjoyment of human rights in the digital sphere. This means protecting data privacy, curtailing mass surveillance, ensuring access to human and labor rights of workers in the platforms, including protecting the data rights of workers, and ensuring that algorithms are not used to consolidate and mask bias. Proposals to ban governments from being able to require source code disclosure, like are being proposed in the WTO, are grossly inappropriate in this regard. However, there is another question, and my final one. How can countries have redistributive policies to ensure equity in a digital world when large firms pay no taxes? We see that developed countries are proposing the elimination of tariffs on e-transmissions, an increase in the de minimis, as my colleague Sonia mentioned, and a ban on requirements that firms that operate have to have a physical presence in the country. However, if firms do not have to have a physical presence in the country, how can they be taxed? Actually, this is the reason why they don't want to have a physical presence in the country. They cannot be taxed, let alone be held accountable by consumers, workers, and government regulators. At the same time, they're still demanding rights to be able to operate in all countries. In order to foster development from the digital economy, digital firms must contribute to the national tax base, just as domestic firms do and just as workers do. Again, we have papers on this on the side, and I'd just like to again thank UNCTAD for the opportunity to contribute to the debate, and I look forward to further exchange of views. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. Now, the final speaker on our list before we go to general comment, if anybody has any, is Ruzana Tavadiam, who is the founding president of the Geneva Consensus Foundation. Please
Thank you very much indeed. I think after all these very rich talks, I would like to summarize, given the time, on just a couple of few comments. I have recently got very exciting charts shared by World Economic Forum, whereby they try to demonstrate in 60 seconds how many Facebook logins we have, which is 973,000, 18 million text messages, like 4.3 million YouTube video views, 300. So the message in itself is quite demonstrative of challenge we are talking here, because we are speaking here about 1 minute. So if this is the magnitude of a problem, then, I mean, all the organizations and development partners have to try to organize how best they can serve the society. Speaking about UNCTAD, I consider UNCTAD as a main UN organization which is dealing with globalization more than trade, because that's, I believe, what distinguishes also UNCTAD from the WTO, because here we are going beyond the trade, but speaking about investment and other aspects, how trade will ensure the development. So the question, I believe, when I was reading the document, is how UNCTAD can best serve this process. And perhaps within the mandate and within particular competence of looking how consequences of globalization for developing countries, perhaps UNCTAD can initiate and mandate research which will look at cross-country analysis, how digitalization will influence, because digitalization itself can be considered as the one and the main indicator of globalization. I don't know if colleagues are aware about the recent World Input-Output tables, which brings together 43 countries, 28 European and 15 others, and which speaks about 56 sectors. I think now we have a very profound database which can be used for this kind of research exercises to found informed decisions, because everything we speak here is about what? And I think what the question is, what has been at the heart of the Mafichiano, is how we move from to the actions, how we are going to take this forward. And I believe UNCTAD has a very good position to commission few reports to look how globalization in represented digital sector will influence development. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, before we wrap up, does anybody else have any comments, questions at all? Okay, well, we almost managed to get ourselves back on time, so that's very good indeed. I won't be too long. I just wanted to thank you all very much indeed for coming to this event. I think the interactions have been splendid, and I apologize again that I had to step out. I'd just like to echo the comments by Dr. Kitui and Ms. Durand about the importance that we place on our partnership with all of you, the organizations that are here, those organizations that are not represented, but with whom we also work. We're very much looking forward to fruitful discussions with you in whatever format as we continue to re-energize our work with civil society. So please do stay in touch. We're looking for any opportunity possible to dialogue with you. Thank you once again for coming, and we look forward to interacting with you indeed during the Trade and Development Board. If you're able to come to that, that's in the first week of June, the high-level segment. Particularly, I would recommend, given what we've been talking about today. So I don't know if there's anything else. Maybe, Tim, you may like to add something.
Yeah, just with the Trade and Development Board, exactly. The difference, just one note, because there are some organizations still in here. In order to be able to participate in the Trade and Development Board, you do need to have observer status with UNCTAD. For this event, for this hearing, we were able to allow that to open up a bit so that it was those that have observer status with UNCTAD, those that have been accredited to UNCTAD 14, the last ministerial conference we had. And then also we opened it up to those that do have consultative status with ECOSOC and are working on issues that are related to UNCTAD. But for the Trade and Development Board to be inside the room and to talk to take the floor at that moment, you do have to have observer status. If you're not sure if your organization has observer status or not, please contact us. It is on our website. We have a list of everyone. If you're interested in having observer status, please contact us. We're taking applications. For those of you that do have observer status, you may also, if you cannot make it to Geneva for the Trade and Development Board, you can submit a written contribution that we will submit. It will be posted on the website for the Trade and Development Board. So please take that into consideration. The deadline for that, there really is no, but the Trade and Development starts on the 4th of June, so before it starts. That would be the deadline.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim, and thank you to those of you who were following us on Facebook Live. Thank you.